Chapter 922. The people were facing the stone tablet. And the people who were tied up and kneeling on the ground were also facing the stone tablet. Thus, no one could see their faces clearly. Only when one person mustered up the courage to walk forward and lowered his head to take a look did he let out a cry of surprise. This looks like Assistant Minister Wei of the Ministry of Works. That can't be. Why is Assistant Minister Wei kneeling here? Isn't that Official Han? Why is he also kneeling here? Official Feng, Official Qi, Lord Wei, heavens, what is going on? Why are they all kneeling here? The people present naturally couldn't recognize all the faces of these people, but there were always some people who, due to their status, often appeared in front of the people, so it wasn't difficult to recognize them. It was also because of this that everyone present was shocked and in disbelief. Because all the people kneeling here were high-ranking officials and dignitaries of the capital. Who would have thought that these people, who were usually so high and mighty that they couldn't even come into contact with, were at this moment tied up with ropes and kneeling in front of the stone tablet in the ancestral hall. Their eyes could clearly move, but their bodies couldn't move, and their mouths couldn't speak. It was broad daylight. Could it be that he had seen a ghost? Finally, someone noticed the abnormality. He pointed at the papers in front of these people and said to the crowd, "Look what's written on these papers." Someone picked up a piece of paper and looked at it. The expression on his face was at first stunned, then gradually became one of hatred and anger. These corrupt officials, they're beasts. Under his lead, everyone walked forward and picked up the papers that were pressed down by the stones on the ground. These corrupt officials are actually so daring, right under the feet of the emperor of the capital. For these things, even if they died 10 or 100 times, it still wouldn't be enough. Could it be that the heavens have shown their will and dragged out all these beasts to kneel before Lady Shuang's memorial tablet? The heavens have eyes, the heavens have eyes. The papers in everyone's hands were densely filled with the crimes committed by these officials and nobles who were kneeling on the ground in their entire lives. Every single one of them was horrifying, and it caused one's heart to go cold just by looking at it. They had no idea that these people, who usually looked bright and noble on the outside, were actually so dirty on the inside. When they knelt neatly in front of the tombstone, and the crimes that they had signed and stamped were placed in front of everyone, the suppressed emotions in the hearts of the people suddenly exploded. One of them finally couldn't take it anymore. He kicked the person closest to him, who was kneeling on the ground, and said angrily, You all deserve to die. Yes, kill them so that they don't come out and harm people again. Kill them and get rid of the scourge for the people." After the first few people made a move, the crowd immediately became enraged. They pushed the people kneeling on the ground and started punching and kicking them. The people kneeling on the ground were not only tied up with ropes, but their acupoints were also sealed. Other than being able to move their eyes, they could not even speak a word, let alone struggle to escape. They could only endure the rage of the crowd. The commotion in the ancestral hall quickly attracted the attention of the people nearby. The crowd surrounded the ancestral hall so tightly that not even a drop of water could trickle through. The people on the outside had no idea what was going on. They couldn't squeeze in, but people kept coming in from behind. Out of the way, out of the way! The bailiffs were always late out of habit. After a full quarter of an hour, more than 10 bailiffs ran over from afar. They pushed through the crowd and squeezed into the ancestral hall. "Stop, all of you stop." Seeing the chaos in the ancestral hall, the expressions of the bailiffs changed. Regardless of the identity of the people who were tied up and beaten black and blue on the ground, and regardless of the reason for this scene, if they continued to beat them like this, they were afraid that someone would die. The uniformed bailiffs with weapons in their hands were still a great deterrent to the ordinary people. The crowd gradually dispersed, and at the same time, they did not forget to add a few more kicks. What exactly is going on? One of the bailiffs looked at the pitiful state of the people and felt a chill in his heart. He asked loudly, "Sir, look at this." A commoner handed over a thick stack of paper. After the bailiffs flipped through a few pieces of paper, his legs couldn't help but feel weak. He only managed to stabilize himself after being supported by the people behind him. Save me." A weak cry for help came from under his feet. The constable sensed that someone was holding his ankle. He hurriedly squatted down and asked, Who are you? I am the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Works, Wei Wei. The Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Justice, whose face was already swollen like a pig's head, fainted before he could finish his sentence. The bailiffs looked at him and carefully tried to identify him for a long time, but he still couldn't see which part of him resembled the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Works. He sat on the ground with a pale face. It didn't matter if this person was the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Works or not. If he wasn't the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Justice, he could be another Assistant Minister or some other influential official. It didn't matter who he was. What was important was that the sky had fallen. He pointed outside in a panic and said, "Quick, go to the yamen and call someone. Tell Sir Tsung that something big has happened." At the same time, in the mansion of an official in the capital, a servant stood at the door of a room. He paced back and forth for a long time and said with some confusion, "Why hasn't Sir gotten out of bed yet? Is he not going to court today?" He finally couldn't help but knock on the door, then pushed it open and entered. Seeing the empty bed, he said in surprise, "Where is Sir?" Not long after, a servant hurriedly ran out of the door and went straight in the direction of the yamen. Along the way, there were many people who were just as panicked as they were. The capital yamen. Sung Shichen had actually just woken up and finished washing up. Before he could beat the drum and start the court, a bailiff ran in from outside in a panic and said with a pale face, "Sir, something big has happened." Sung Shichen frowned and said, "What is it? Tell me slowly." The bailiffs hurriedly said, 40 officials and nobles in the capital were kidnapped last night and were only found this morning. They were all tied up and kneeling in Lady Shuangshuang's ancestral hall. Sung Shichen was startled and asked, "How many did you say?" "Not more, not less. Exactly 40. As soon as he finished speaking, there was already a burst of noise coming from the entrance of the yamen. "I want to report a case. My lord is missing. My marquis is also missing. My old master and second master are missing." Sung Shichen's body swayed, and he had to support himself against the wall to steady himself. More than 40 officials and nobles in the capital had all been kidnapped in one night. Where did these bandits eat the heart of a bear and the leopard's gall? This was not a crime. This was clearly piercing the sky. In front of the yamen, there was a burst of ghostly wails and wolf howls. In the great hall of the imperial palace, the civil and military officials all looked puzzled. Without the slightest sign, the number of people in court today was nearly 20% less than the day before. Although the court was not empty, the crowd had indeed become much sparser. The censors were standing in a line at the front, impeaching the officials who were absent from court for no reason. A eunuch ran in quickly from outside. Because he was too flustered, he even tripped when he stepped into the hall. He stumbled and crawled in. He knelt on the ground and said in a panicked voice, "Your Highness, the capital governor has an urgent report." A moment later, the originally quiet court suddenly became an uproar. Above the great hall, the eldest princess slowly stood up. As if she had thought of something, her expression changed slightly. Wave after wave of news, with a certain ancestral hall as the center, spread within a few hours. The capital was shaken. Chapter 923. This was probably the fastest the government had ever handled a case. The people who had reported the case were still at the door of the yamen. There was no need to rush to redress their grievances, but the important figures who had been lost had all been found. Logically speaking, regardless of whether it was the government or the people who had reported the case, this was a joyous matter. The case had been solved, and everyone could go home and find their own mothers. No one would be troubled. However, the matter was not so simple. The people who had been tied up were all influential figures in the capital, and 40 of them had been tied up quietly. They had only been discovered in the morning. This was probably the worst case that had happened in the capital since the founding of the country. After today, how could the other officials and nobles in the capital sleep peacefully? After all, no one wanted to go to sleep at night and wake up the next day in a strange place. Their bodies were tied up, unable to move or speak, and they had to kneel in front of the people. This case had to be investigated, thoroughly investigated. If those vicious thugs were allowed to roam freely in the capital, No one would be able to sleep peacefully in the future. This was only one of the reasons. The papers that recorded the crimes of the officials and nobles who were tied up had long been spread by the mouth of the public. They were indeed the victims, but at the same time, they were the perpetrators. The words that were written with blood and tears could be verified to prove their authenticity. The court was in the midst of a legal reform. Although the crimes of the nobles and nobles could not be equated with those of the common people, if a common person committed any of the crimes, they would be beheaded dozens or hundreds of times. It would not be too much to just behead them once, right? Each of these people had committed grave crimes. There were countless eyes watching outside. Who would dare to let them go back? Sung Shichen rubbed the space between his eyebrows. He had already ordered the bailiffs and bailiffs to bring those people back, but other than a few who could speak, the others seemed to have been cast with a paralysis spell. Even though their noses were bruised and their faces swollen, they could not make a sound of pain, much less move. Sir Tsung, can I bring my master back? Sir, my master is injured and needs immediate treatment. Your government is not going to catch those assassins, but instead detain these officials here. What are your intentions? Sung Shichen rubbed his temples again when he heard the shouts coming from outside the hall. Those people were either nobles or high officials. Even he couldn't offend so many clans at the same time. Just as he was having a headache, a constable finally walked in with a happy expression and said loudly, "Sir, someone from the palace has come." It was not only the eunuchs who came from the palace to announce the imperial edict, but also the medical officials of the Imperial Physician Bureau. After examining them, the imperial physician Lu Jimin shook his head and said, "These people have all had their acupoints sealed. It's the technique of a warrior." A gray-robed old man walked out from the back. He stretched out his hand and pointed at one of the men's necks. In the next moment, a miserable howl was heard. The man finally regained his freedom. He covered his buttocks and screamed miserably. The gray-robed old man walked around the crowd and unsealed everyone's acupoints one by one. Suddenly, everyone heard a series of screams, and the situation went out of control. Sung Shichen stepped forward, looked at the young man at the front, and asked, "What did His Highness say?" Lu Yichuan looked at him and slowly said, "Investigate thoroughly." Sung Shichen nodded and said, 40 officials have been arrested. The impact is too bad. If we don't investigate clearly, many of the officials in the court will not agree. A thorough investigation naturally has to be conducted. However, to be able to commit such a crime without anyone knowing, I'm afraid it's not the work of an ordinary person. It won't be easy to investigate this case. The crimes committed by these sinful officials and nobles must be thoroughly investigated. Lu Yichuan looked at him and said, "These people will temporarily stay in the capital government office. The Imperial Physician Bureau will treat their injuries. The Secret Intelligence Bureau will take over everything else." A smile appeared on Sung Shichen's face. He placed a thick stack of papers in Lu Yichuan's hand and said, "I'll have to trouble Lord Lu." The onlookers had already surrounded the capital government office. If those wicked people who had committed heinous crimes walked out, it was likely that some uncontrollable events would occur. Fortunately, this time, the court did not disappoint them. Not a single one of the 40 people walked out of the government office. The capital governor's manor had also put up a notice outside, expressing strong condemnation of those audacious thieves who had kidnapped officials and nobles. At the same time, it expressed that the case would be strictly investigated, and the thieves would be arrested as soon as possible, so that the capital could be restored to order. As for the crimes that these 40 people had confessed to, the government would certainly verify them one by one. Once verified, they would not be tolerated. If the people had any clues or evidence, they were welcome to provide them, and they were also welcome to supervise. If the government handled the case like this every time, the people would naturally not be dissatisfied, and the grievances like doe's would probably not occur. The people were very satisfied with the way the government handled the case, and their emotions were no longer agitated. They no longer gathered in front of the government office, and gradually dispersed. However, their attention did not shift. Overnight, the capital government office, including the 40 mansions, became the focus of the entire capital. The Chui family, No one from the Chui family had gone missing last night, but they were even more frightened than the families who had gone missing. 40 people, their last remaining force in the capital, their last trump card, had been wiped out in one night. In one night. Completely wiped out. It was not just 40 people, it was 40 families. They had spent a great deal of effort to win over the power that they had. They all had something on the Chui family, and they were bound together for good or ill with the Chui family. They were not people in the same boat. The Chui family's ship was in front, and their small boats were connected to it. The Chui family's ship rode the wind and waves, and they could also move forward. If the Chui family's ship sank, they would sink with it. The destruction of one small boat had a limited impact on the big boat, but if all 40 small boats on the big boat sank, how could the Chui family ride the waves alone? As soon as he heard the news, the current head of the Chui family, Chui Qingming, was so angry that he spat out a mouthful of blood, and had yet to wake up. The people of the Chui family gathered in the meeting hall, and everyone's faces were filled with panic. In just one night, the Chui family had gone from having countless supporters to being alone. Although they could not be considered alone, there was still the Qin family, the Chen family, and the Zheng family. But at this time, they could no longer affect the general situation. This was not the most frightening thing. The crimes of those people might be related to the Chui family in some way. If their crimes were proven, the Chui family and the Chui family would find it very difficult to escape. Originally, because of the King of Shu's return to the capital, they had finally seen a glimmer of light, but once again, it was covered by a huge black curtain. The Qin family. The daring thieves must be investigated, but as officials and nobles, they disregarded the law and acted so unscrupulously. They are destined to be punished by the law. His Majesty has already ordered a strict investigation of this case. Although it will cause a great shock in the capital, in the long run, the benefits outweigh the disadvantages. At the family banquet, Qin Xiang looked at the people below and said in a low voice, "You must all take this as a warning." Clang. Qin Yan's hands trembled. He could not hold the bowl in his hands, and it fell to the ground with a crisp sound. Beside him, his two brothers, who were also officials in the imperial court, were also pale. At the bottom of the banquet, the Qin family's fifth master picked up a mouthful of food and tore off a chicken leg. He threw it to the man standing in the corner, and continued to eat with his head lowered. The news of the kidnapping of 40 officials and nobles in the capital was known to Li Yi last night. The case that the old emperor had ordered him to investigate was about to reach its deadline. Suddenly, the suspects turned themselves in one after another, and there was no need to investigate at all. His recent luck was simply too good. Until the eldest princess, who was not in a good mood, walked in from outside and asked, "Have you forgotten what you promised me?" Sitting across from him, Mississippi Lu, who was reading a book, put down her book and raised her head to look over. Clearly, she also wanted to know what Li Yi had promised her. Li Yi looked at the eldest princess, then turned to look at Mississippi Lu and said, "Rui, can you leave for a moment?" Chapter 924. Okay. Mississippi Lu nodded, closed the book, got up, and walked back to the room. Looking at her back that was so calm and unaffected, it seemed that she was really not interested in the matter at all. Li Yi couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. There must be something wrong when things are abnormal. With how much Rui cared about him, she would haggle over small things like a lip mark on his face, a strand of hair on his clothes, and staying out at night. How could she not be interested in his promise to another woman? What's more, this woman was her enemy. Princess Royal's expression was calm. She looked at him and asked, "Are you listening to me?" Li Yi found that he had made a mistake, a big mistake. When a woman was talking to him, he was thinking about another woman. Moreover, the woman he was thinking about was bigger than the one in front of him. He quickly turned his head and lowered his head, saying, "I'm listening. I'm listening." "What did I say just now?" Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "What did I promise you?" "I promised you a lot of things. Which one are you talking about? Other than not bringing soup to see you these few days, there's nothing wrong with what I've done. You promised me that you wouldn't act rashly." Emingzu looked at him and said with a frown, "Do you know how dangerous this matter is and how big the impact will be? This case is not only shocking the capital, but the whole world. The officials are panicking, and all the civil and military officials in the court are asking for a thorough investigation of this case. What will you do if the truth is found out? You suspect that I did this case? Li stood up and looked at her in surprise. I'm a little embarrassed when you say that. I didn't expect that I'm so powerful in your heart. In fact, I'm a little weaker than you think. Although those people are all guilty, there are still the authorities, the court. Emingzu looked at him and said solemnly, have you ever thought that if the Secret Intelligence Bureau finds out the truth, you will have to face all the officials and nobles in the capital? If I don't have you, what will I do? Li sighed. He originally wanted to cultivate her ability to do things on her own, but now, it seemed that she was getting further and further away from this goal. Mississippi Lu walked over, picked up autumn water from the table, and said, you guys continue. After saying that, he simply turned around and walked back. Li shook his head and asked, did His Majesty say anything? Father ordered the Secret Intelligence Bureau to investigate this case thoroughly, and all the officials and nobles who are guilty will be. Emingzu looked at him, as if she had thought of something, and said in surprise, Father knows about this. It's precisely because this case has too many implications that we have enough power to drag the Cui family into this, and uproot the Cui family and the King of Shu's faction. Li looked at her and asked, you don't want everyone to know that the King of Shu is not His Majesty's biological son, do you? She looked at Li and asked, so it was Father who instructed you to do this? Li nodded. When? The day I entered the palace last time. This matter had to be carried out with lightning speed, leaving them no time to react. It was impossible for the imperial court to mobilize a large number of imperial guards to confiscate the property of the Cui family, and the capital would probably be in an uproar. Although this method was suspected of cheating, it was simple, direct, and violent. Moreover, it had the tacit consent of the old emperor, so the risk was minimal. The matter of the King of Shu could not be made known to everyone. This was not allowed by the imperial court. Therefore, there needed to be a reason to catch all these people in one fell swoop, and not leave any loose ends. Under the leadership of the Lu League, the atmosphere in the martial arts world had changed greatly. Punishing the strong and helping the weak, and helping the needy were actually working for the imperial court in disguise. This force was very powerful, but it could not be directly used by the imperial court. A long time ago, he and the old emperor had reached an agreement on this force. Emingzu looked at him, and a trace of disappointment appeared on her face. You and Father have already discussed this. Then let's leave it at that. After saying this, she turned and walked out. Seeing the change in her expression, Li hurriedly stood up and caught up with her. He said, I'm sorry, it's my fault. Emingzu shook her head and said, you're not wrong. I'm wrong. You're not wrong. I'm really wrong. Emingzu stopped and turned to look at him. She crossed her arms in front of her chest. Tell me, what did you do wrong? It was the greatest virtue to know one's mistake and correct it. After admitting his mistake, Li shook his head and said, it's my fault to hide such a big thing from you. However, there are some things that you also hid from me. What things? Emingzu frowned slightly. She didn't even hide the time of her menstrual cycle from him. What else did she not tell him? She was sincere, but in exchange, she hid and suspected the person who was very important to him. It was hard to describe the feeling in words. What you hid from me is that you actually don't need to drink soup anymore. Li looked at her and said, if you weren't wrapped. Her Royal Highness went back and didn't mention the matter of hiding anymore. Mississippi Lu walked out of the room and returned to her original seat to read. Li glanced at her and reminded her, you're holding the book upside down. So Mississippi Lu stopped reading. She put the book on the table and began to look at him. Li explained, just now we talked about some matters of the court. Mississippi Lu asked, does the matter of the court also include the question, what will she do without you? Li looked at her and said seriously, I swear to God, the relationship between me and the eldest princess is very pure, just like the relationship between me and you. Mississippi Lu thought for a moment, and couldn't help but remember that night when he was drunk and broke into the study in the middle of the night. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Qin's mansion was Qin's mansion after all. Even if they brought people from Qin's mansion to be investigated, the people of the intelligence division still had a polite expression. My lords, thank you for your trouble. Qin Yan's face was pale and his eyes were lifeless. The two people behind him also had the same expression. Qin Xiang seemed to have aged a lot overnight. When he walked up the stairs, his body swayed slightly. The Qin family's fifth master immediately went up to support him. There are steps. Be careful, father. The leader of the intelligence division walked up and said respectfully, Don't worry, Prime Minister. The lords are only going to be investigated. If those people framed us, we will definitely send the lords back in one piece. Even after the people of the intelligence division left, Qin Xiang's gaze was still fixed in that direction. He whispered, What if it's not framed? No one answered. The Qin family's fifth master supported him and turned around. He whispered, Father, it's windy outside. Let's go back. After the Qin family's three influential officials walked out of Qin's mansion, they never came back. Based on the confessions of the 40 people, the intelligence division effortlessly found the Devil's Den 30 miles away from the capital. They also found the dozens of missing women. When they pointed out that the place where they were previously hidden was the Qin family's manor, the career of Qin Xiang's eldest son, Qin Yan, came to an end. Although the other two people's crimes were not as serious as Qin Yan's, they were involved in several other cases. They couldn't stand up to the intelligence division's investigation, and were imprisoned one after another. In just a few days, Qin Xiang was the only one left in the court of the once glorious Qin family. And this was not the end. As case after case was investigated, more and more people began to point fingers at the Cui family. In the Cui family's meeting hall, the atmosphere was bleak. From the nobles and officials to the common people, everyone's eyes were focused on the progress of this monstrous case. All the support they could obtain in the court was almost completely destroyed. Even if there was some left, it wouldn't be of much use. A middle-aged man had a panicked expression. He said, Second brother, what should we do? Say something. Cui Qingming's eyes were bloodshot, but he still forced himself to remain calm. He murmured, We still have the Empress and His Highness. His Highness will be back soon. The Cui family will not perish. The Cui family will not perish. Chapter 925. The capital city was chaotic these days, but it was chaotic in an orderly manner. The reason for the chaos was that since the founding of the Jing Kingdom, there had never been so many officials and nobles who fell from power at the same time in such a short period of time. The 40 or so people were just a prelude. According to their confessions, when the Secret Intelligence Bureau investigated the case, they dragged the Qin family and the Cui family into the water. Every day, people's houses would be searched, and prisoner carts would pass through the streets. Such a big movement made the entire capital city a mess. The chaos was orderly because every time a position was vacant in the court, someone would quickly fill it, so it did not have much impact on the court. The promotion of this monstrous case was completely the general trend. Everyone in the world was watching. Once it started, it was like a surging river, rushing forward, and there was no turning back. In fact, not many people paid attention to the thieves who had kidnapped these people from their homes. Flipping the table was really an addictive thing. It was simple, violent, and effective. Once people had enough power in their hands, they liked to take shortcuts and were unwilling to be bound by the rules of the world. This was not a good thing, and one should learn from it. However, this matter was originally agreed by the old emperor in advance. Now that the old emperor blamed him, it was completely like getting rid of the donkey after it was no longer of use. Li looked at Emperor Jing, who was leaning against the bed, and said, Your Majesty, you said that if normal methods don't work, we can use some extreme methods. The old emperor raised his eyebrows and looked at him. I said extreme. I allowed you to arrest a few people to interrogate. Who asked you to arrest everyone? Since ancient times, kings were the most heartless. This sentence was not wrong at all. The emperor was the most temperamental person. It was clearly what he said, but in the blink of an eye, he did not admit it. It was simply like burning the bridge after crossing the river, uprooting. At this time, It was better not to refute. Li lowered his head and ate the porridge, no longer saying anything. You have made such a big mess for me, and you still have the mood to eat porridge here. Jingdi looked at him and felt angry. He said, go to the Hall of Diligent Government and reflect for 2 hours. Think about what you did wrong this time. The emperor's words were like gold and jade. This bowl of porridge was probably not going to be finished. Li tore a chicken leg and hid it in his sleeve. He bowed and said, this subject obeys your majesty. Looking at him slowly leaving, Emperor Jing coughed a few times and sighed, saying, if everything could be broken like this, how much worry would I have? As the emperor, he seemed to have the highest authority in the country. However, it was precisely because of his high authority that he was bound by many things. Changde closed the door and opened a window for ventilation. He said, your majesty only needs to rest well. Leave these matters to them. In the end, the drumstick did not fall into Li Yi's mouth. The proud Lolita fed Yongning a bite, and then took a bite herself. She crossed her legs and sat opposite Li Yi. She asked him when he would take her to the academy. The academy that Li Yi gave her had been built. It was called the Shaning Academy. The 14-year-old proud Lolita was not only the honorary dean, but she also held the real power of the academy. As for what she wanted to do, Li Yi did not intend to care. However, with her temperament, he was afraid that when the novelty period was over, she would directly throw it to Emingzu. When he said that Emingzu and Emingzu had arrived, he had 2 hours to reflect. He only said that he could not leave the Hall of Diligent Government within these 2 hours. As for sleeping or eating hot pot in the Hall of Diligent Government, the old emperor did not say. The proud Lolita smelled the smell from afar. She got up from the ground and ran over barefoot. She asked excitedly, royal sister, what delicious food did you bring? The royal princess put down the food box and opened it layer by layer. She placed it on the ground in front of Li Yi and handed him a pair of chopsticks. I don't think I ate much at father's place just now. I asked the catering department to make this. This was the reason why he liked the royal princess. She could be in the imperial court and in the kitchen. Although she was cooking for someone else, her style was ever-changing. Who would not like her to be able to freely change from a domineering empress to a caring wife? Perhaps women were born with a few different faces. Even second Miss Liu, who had always been like an iceberg, was able to control several different styles in recent days. Knowing that her royal sister and her husband had something to discuss, the proud Lolita took Yongning to the side to play. Li Emingzu took out a small wine pot and poured himself a cup. She asked, is there really nothing that you are afraid of? He did not even let himself finish a bowl of porridge. Li Yi was a little hungry. He asked as he picked up some food. What do you mean? To be able to make so many officials and nobles disappear from their homes in one night. Li Emingzu looked at him and said slowly, in so many years, you are the first. They will not think that you are strong. They will only think that you are a threat. What do you think father wants you to think about? Li shook his head and said, you are wrong about 2 things. The one who made them disappear wasn't me, it was His Majesty. He looked at Emingzu and said, moreover, there are things that I am afraid of and people. You are not even afraid of father. Who are you afraid of? I am afraid of Lu Rui. Li Emingzu looked at him and asked why. She will hit me, Li said honestly. If you are like her, I will also be afraid of you. He actually understood the royal princess worries. The nobles were the most arrogant group of people. Compared to the common people, they were the upper class. They had always lived at the top of the food chain. It had always been them who kidnapped others. When did it become others' turn to kidnap them? Now it really was. The incident this time made them understand that even if they lived in the capital and had so-called martial arts skilled guards at home, it was not enough to guarantee their safety. It was very possible that in the blink of an eye, they would be transported from their own home to some other place. They would not think that the thieves were powerful. They would only think that they were a great threat. If they could not resolve this threat as soon as possible, they would not be able to eat or sleep in peace. This was not something that could be explained by the old emperor's trust and tacit approval. This capital, this country, was still in the hands of the upper class. If the matter was made clear, they could no longer stay in the capital. They could only take Rui, and Xiaohuan back to their old business. Li shook his head and looked at her. Don't worry. This kind of thing will only happen once. Then he saw the proud Lolita walk over with the wine pot in her arms. She smiled foolishly and said, Sir, how did you become two? Li Emingzu looked to her side. The wine pot had already disappeared. The drunk proud Lolita was spanked and sent back to her room to sleep. Li Yi accompanied Yong Ning and spoke in a language that only the two of them could understand. When it was time, he said goodbye to her and left the imperial palace. The Cui family and the King of Shu's faction had lost their power. Although they had not been completely uprooted, he still felt that there was something the old emperor had not let him and Emingzu know. And that matter would probably be the last straw that broke the Cui family's back. Li Yi met Chen Chong at the gate of the Zeng residence. Chen Chong looked at him and asked, It should be over, right? Li Yi shook his head. When it ends is up to His Majesty. Right now, it is only the beginning. Chapter 926. For the Cui family, what was happening now was really just the beginning. Just the fact that the King of Shu was not the biological son of the emperor was enough to send the entire Cui family, including noble consort Cui, to hell. Although the truth had not been revealed, the lightest punishment was the crime of deceiving the emperor and stealing the country. If it was more serious, no one knew which was more serious, deceiving the emperor or lying to him. But no matter which one it was, everyone related to the Cui family would not be able to escape. Chen Chong's expression changed several times and finally turned pale. Looking at Li Yi, he bowed and said, Thank you. Li Yi nodded and turned to walk into the Zeng residence. When Drunk Ink saw him come in, she quickly hid the wedding dress in her hand. Li Yi did not ask much. Her wedding dress was all embroidered, and it would be done in a few days. There was no hurry to do it in a day or two. He opened his mouth, but before he could say a word, Goddess Luo Shui walked in with the wedding dress and said, You guys talk first. I'll go in and finish the painting. Li Yi looked at her back in surprise, then looked at Ruoqing and asked, What's wrong with her recently? Wan Ruoqing shook her head, her pretty face showing the same puzzlement. Li Yi frowned. Miss Zeng had been a little unusual recently. The last time he came, she said she was not feeling well and needed to rest, so she asked Ruoqing to chat with him. The last time, she said she had a stomachache and went back to her room to rest alone, so she asked Ruoqing to chat with him. But Li Yi knew very well that there was still at least half a month before her stomachache. The last time, she said she stayed up all night to embroider the wedding dress and was too tired. She wanted to go back to her room to rest, so it was Ruoqing who talked with him. The last time, there were too many examples to mention. Something must have happened, something he did not know. Could it be premarital anxiety? Thinking about it, it seemed very likely. Many women would suffer from this disease before they got married, because it was due to some kind of psychological factor. Different people showed different symptoms. Perhaps, the symptom she displayed was avoidance? Li Yi waved at Xiao Cui and waited for her to come over before asking, Has your family's young miss been behaving strangely recently? No. After Xiao Cui thought about it, she shook her head and said, It's the same as before. There's nothing strange. After saying that, he seemed to have thought of something and patted his head, saying, If there is anything, it would be that Miss has been sleeping in Sister Ruoqing's room these past few days. It has been a long time since she slept alone. Li Yi looked at Wan Ruoqing. She nodded slightly and said, She said that she's moving away soon and asked me to accompany her. There's nothing strange about that. Li Yi suddenly looked at her and asked, When she slept with you, did she touch you? What touch? Wan Ruoqing asked doubtfully. Then she was stunned and blushed. Drunk Mo's personality was very active. She liked to play on the bed, and was not obedient when she slept. Sometimes, something that made people blush would indeed happen. Seeing the blush on her face, Li couldn't help but imagine some scenes in his mind. Then his face turned a little red, and then a little white. He turned to look at Wan Ruoqing with a complicated expression. Drunk Mo was his, and Ruoqing would be his sooner or later. The situation now was that the two of them slept on the same bed, and often did things that made people blush. Who liked who cheated on who, and who let down who? No, he needed to think about this problem. The capital had been very turbulent these days. It was not an exaggeration to say that it was a monstrous wave. Even the powerful Chui clan and Qing clan, although they did not fall apart, were on the verge of collapse. As for the other smaller clans, under such a huge wave, not even their corpses were left. The Chen clan had always been very close to the Chui clan, and was only slightly inferior to the Qing clan. It was really a miracle that they were not affected in the slightest by this storm. At this time, in the Chen clan, the atmosphere was not as relaxed as everyone thought. It's just the beginning, just the beginning. Chen Qing paced in the hall and said with a sullen face, "If this is just the beginning, then to what extent will it be considered to be the end?" Chen Cheng sat on the chair. His expression was much calmer than his. He raised his head and looked outside. Perhaps we still have to add in the king of Shu, or even that person in the palace, before it will be considered to be the end. Chen Qing turned his head and said in disbelief, "How is this possible?" Chen Cheng shook his head and said, "If this is just the beginning, then this time, no matter what, the Chen clan will not be able to escape." He looked at Chen Qing and said, "There has to be one person in the Chen clan who has to stand up. I'm not here anymore. In the future, take good care of third sister. If you encounter any problems that you can't solve, go find him." "No." Chen Qing decided to cut him off. "Even if someone has to go, it will be me. You stay behind to take care of third sister. This matter is decided. Big brother, you still have hope." Chen Cheng looked at him and said, "Let me bear the Chen clan's past alone." Chen Qing's expression was cold. He shook his head and said, "No, this definitely won't do. Big brother, second brother." As the two of them were arguing, a delicate figure walked in from the door. Their expressions changed and they said at the same time, "Third sister, why are you here?" Chen Cheng walked over and said hurriedly, "I have something to discuss with big brother." "You should go back and rest first." The girl with snow-white hair shook her head, but a smile appeared on her face. She said firmly, "I am also a member of the Chen clan. No matter what happens, now you will face it together with big brother and second brother." Chen Cheng looked at her, patted her hand, and strode out of the door. This official is guilty. In front of a certain hall in the imperial palace, Chen Cheng knelt down and said loudly, "Chen clan." On the couch, Jing Di put down the booklet in his hand and shook his head in disappointment. "Let Emingzu handle this matter." The 9-month-old Li Duan could already crawl everywhere. Even when the eldest princess walked in, Li Yi was still tirelessly moving him from the side of the bed to the inside of the bed. When he crawled out, she would repeat this action. She probably had something to discuss with him at this time. Li Yi carried the little fellow and passed him to Rui. Li Duan, on the other hand, reached out his little hand to Xiao Huan. In this family, the little fellow was like an emperor, but the emperor also had someone he was afraid of, and that person was Lu Rui. Mississippi Lu might be born with a kind of deterrence. Usually, when she looked at Li Duan, he absolutely did not dare to cry or pester her. "Xiao Huan, let's go out." Mississippi Lu glanced at Xiao Huan and got up to leave. Xiao Huan held Li Duan and went out obediently. Emingzu handed him a booklet and said, "Take a look at this." Li opened the booklet and read it carefully. He lowered his head and asked in a low voice, "If it is judged normally, what will be the result?" "The Chen clan has a lot of evidence of crimes." Emingzu looked at him and said, "Although the House of Duke will still be considered, the death penalty can be avoided, but the punishment cannot be avoided. In the direct line, the men will be exiled, and the women will be reduced to lowly status and put into the musical house." She looked at Li Yi and said, "So, I'm here to ask for your opinion. Does this count as abusing power for personal gain?" "Yes." However, she looked at Li Yi and said, "Leniency for those who confess, severity for those who resist." Chen Cheng turned himself in, and according to the law, he should also be punished according to the circumstances. Li Yi knew that with her character, it would not be easy for her to make such a decision. But he absolutely could not watch Miss Chen fall into such a situation. His heart was slightly warmed. He held her hand and said seriously, "Thank you for this." Emingzu shook her head. There is no need to say thank you between us. Mississippi Lou came in from outside, walked to the bed, and picked up the autumn water that had fallen here. Then she looked at the two of them, and her eyes stopped on their hands that were held together. She asked, "What happened between you?" Chapter 927. Lee was a little worried. No, he was very worried. Mississippi Lou's memory was getting worse and worse. She used to like autumn water so much. Her sword never left her body. She liked autumn water even more than she liked him. But now, she actually forgot autumn water again and again. This was not normal, too abnormal. If it was a bad memory. But how old was she? She was in the prime of her life. Lee could be sure that before he became senile and forgot things, Mississippi Lou would never reach this step first. Maybe in the future, she and Rui would take turns pushing the wheelchair under the sunset, and he would be the one sitting in the wheelchair. What a beautiful and harmonious scene. The scene in front of him was not very harmonious. Mississippi Lou came back to get autumn water. He held the Princess Royal's hand with a face full of affection. In fact, this time it was really out of instinct, without any impurities. Emingzu was such an upright person that she could not tolerate any dirt in her eyes. It was not easy for her to sacrifice herself for the country and make such concessions for his feelings. Words could not express the gratitude in his heart, so he added a little body movement. Coincidentally, it was seen by Mississippi Lou. She usually guarded against Emingzu like a wolf. If he could not explain it clearly this time, he would not be able to cross this hurdle in his life. So Lee reached out and held Mississippi Lou's hand and said calmly, "There is something. Emingzu helped us a lot. I just want to thank her, that's all. Between us, there is nothing." He looked at the two slender white hands on his left and right and said, "It's just holding hands to thank her." Lee felt that he was very smart. It was not easy to explain to Mississippi Lou while holding the Princess Royal's hand. But holding two people's hands at the same time, she would not think that he had the same feelings for her as Emingzu, right? Simple? Mississippi Lou curled her lips. Nothing. The Princess Royal shook her head. Hearing a scream from inside the house, Xiaohuan hurriedly ran in, grabbed Li Yi's hand and hurriedly said, "Son-in-law, what happened?" Don't move." Li Yi watched as Mississippi Lou and the Princess Royal left. His expression twitched slightly. He shook his hands hard, and the pain in his hands lessened a little. Two violent women. It was just a handshake. Was there a need to use so much strength? Both of his hands were numb after the pain. Li Yi suspected that the bones in his hands were crushed. If he did not take revenge, he would not be a gentleman. A gentleman's revenge was never too late. 10 years later, he would make them beg for mercy. Seeing Li Yi's pained expression, Xiaohuan asked worriedly, young master, what's wrong?" Feng leaned against the door and looked outside. He retracted his gaze and said with a smile, "Don't worry, it's just that extreme joy turns to sorrow." The injury this time was considered a work injury. As the Minister of State, he had a disagreement with the Princess Royal during a discussion of state affairs, and was injured by her. Therefore, he could have a long time to recuperate. The case that the old emperor ordered him to investigate had expired, but he did not find anything. Fortunately, the criminals found their conscience and turned themselves in, so he did not have to worry about it anymore. The Cui family had fallen. When the tree falls, the monkeys scatter. In their hearts, they were still hoping for the return of the king of Shu to make a comeback. The Qin family had also fallen. Ever since the Qin brothers were imprisoned, Prime Minister Qin fell ill, and did not attend court for a long time. The Chun family was different from the past. Compared to other criminals, their crimes were minor, but they could not be easily pardoned. Considering that High Duke Chun had contributed to the country in his early years, and that he was now old and sick, and that the Chun family had turned themselves in, the punishment was reduced. All the official titles of the Chun family were removed, and they were reduced to commoners. The house of Duke was confiscated, and all their assets were confiscated. This punishment seemed severe, but to the Chun family, it was already a mercy beyond the law. This was all Li Yi could do. It was impossible for the Chun family to return to its former glory, but if they could avoid those power struggles in the future and live a stable life, it might not be a bad thing. All their assets were confiscated. From a wealthy family, they suddenly became poor. This huge difference was not something that ordinary people could bear. Li Yi wanted to help them, but Chen Chong rejected him. He still hated the Li family, and he was even more unwilling to be pitied by the Li family. This was something that Li Yi could understand. Therefore, he only asked people to pay more attention in the dark. When a family was at its peak, there were many people who would add flowers to the brocade. And when it was down, there were many people who would hit it when it was down. He still saw third Miss Chen often. Sometimes he would go to the Chen family to see her, either alone or with Rui. Sometimes he would go to Zui Mo's place. The great change in the Chen family not only did not break her down, but Li Yi felt that she looked much better, which was something to be happy about. Fong squatted in front of him. He seemed to be thinking of something, and he kept giggling. After Xiao Hong entered the family, Fong's sister-in-law was even more strict with him than before, except for Xiao Hong, who was like a sister to Wanru. Fong was actually enjoying himself, which made Li Yi wonder if he had serious masochistic tendencies. A good man had become a masochist for no reason. After being by his side for so long, if this guy could learn a little of his good qualities, he would not have ended up like this. Fong suddenly seemed to think of something. He stopped giggling, looked up at him and said, "Young master, that guy Wu Er, it seems like he is not coming back. Let him be." Li Yi waved his hand, not caring at all. To leave or to stay, that was Wu Er's choice, and only he could feel it. He would not interfere too much. Under the persuasion of Xiao Huan and the others, Lu Mei stayed, and was like a sister to Xiao Hong. Xiao Hong called her sister Mei, and Lu Mei called Fong Uncle Fong. He did not know if Fong, in front of his niece and sister, felt that he was a beast for a moment or a few moments. Although the storm in the capital was big, no matter how big the storm, there would be a day when it would calm down. Confiscation of property, removal of officials, exile. For the whole of June and July, this was the mainstream in the capital. Until August, the upcoming Mid-Autumn Festival seemed to have calmed down all the waves. The people were extremely satisfied with the recent actions of the imperial court, and began to put more attention on the Mid-Autumn Festival. However, the people did not wait for the 15th of August, but Prince Ning first. Prince Ning, who had left the capital a few months ago, returned again. This time he did not come back alone. After Prince Ning's carriage, a row of dozens of prison carriages drove into the capital. The people of the capital stood on both sides of the road, looking at the several li-long procession passing through the street, all showing shock in their eyes. The Li family. Rui and the crown princess made an appointment to go to the cold mountain temple to pray for the safety of the little fellow and the girl from Li Xian's family. After Li Duan woke up, he cried nonstop. Li Yi, with a headache, stuffed him into Rui's arms. The crying stopped abruptly, and Xiao Huan looked on enviously. Second Miss was indeed suitable to look after children. Her Royal Highness came in from outside. Rui glanced at Xiao Huan, stood up and walked outside. Mississippi Lu was becoming more and more considerate. Li Yi felt gratified. As if thinking of something, he suddenly said, "Rui, wait a moment." Mississippi Lu turned her head to look at him. Li Yi picked up the sword she had placed by the bed, walked over, and handed it to her, saying, "You forgot your sword." Chapter 928. It was not a good habit to leave things behind, especially if it was something valuable. It was better to carry it with you. Based on how much Mississippi Lu liked autumn water, if this sword was lost, how sad would she be? Fortunately, she usually left it at home by his side. If she left it outside, it would be hard to find it again. Now that the morals of the world were deteriorating, people's hearts were not what they used to be. Not everyone could pick up a sword without concealing it, and it would be hard to find it again. So Li Yi needed to help her form a good habit again. Seeing that she was stunned, he grabbed her arm, put autumn water in her hand, and said, "Remember, don't forget next time." After Mississippi Lu and Xiao Huan left, Mingzu walked over and closed the door. Li Yi took a few steps back, and immediately became vigilant. Why did she close the door when they were talking nicely? Every time he saw the action of closing the door, he faintly felt some pain in his butt. He called this Mississippi Lu's sequela. Although Emingzu had been influenced by Mississippi Lu recently, and had a tendency to become violent, she probably wouldn't close the door and beat him. After all, except for the last time when he couldn't help but touch her hand, he didn't do anything out of line. And because of the last time, his hand was still a little weak. If it wasn't to beat him, then why did she close the door? Could it be he couldn't beat her in a fight? If she really wanted to do something, he could only struggle for a while, and in the end he might still succumb to her despotic power. Just as Li Yi was thinking about what posture to use to resist, Emingzu finally spoke. Uncle Ning is back. Ah. Seeing that she sat down at the table and didn't seem to have any intention of using despotic power, Li Yi was a little disappointed and asked, Prince Ning returned to the capital. When did it happen? Just now. Emingzu poured a cup of tea for herself and said, the Chui clan, more than 260 people, were all escorted to the capital, and the officials in Shuzhou who had been recruited by the king of Shu were also escorted back by Uncle Ning and locked in the Supreme Court's heavenly prison. What did you say? Li Yi's hand stopped in midair as he stared at her blankly. From the beginning to the end, they had regarded the king of Shu and the Chui family as their greatest enemies. In recent days, they had achieved a gradual victory in the war against the enemy. The Chui family had fallen, and the remaining forces of the Chui family were nothing to be feared. The only thing the king of Shu could rely on was his status as a prince. However, this title also carried quite a bit of weight. This was because the news that he was not a prince could not be made public, and he was still the first prince in the eyes of the commoners and officials. If he wanted to achieve complete victory, he had to use other methods. But who would have thought that before the king of Shu returned to the capital, and before they took any action, even the ancestral home of the Chui family had been uprooted. The officials in Shuzhou who were loyal to the king of Shu had also suffered. The old emperor had flipped the table much more thoroughly than him. Li Yi came back to his senses. He looked at her and asked, where is the king of Shu? He ran away. Emingzu shook her head and said, Imperial uncle didn't expect there to be a master around the king of Shu. He escaped. Li Yi still couldn't understand. When Prince Ning left, the news that the king of Shu was not the biological son of the old emperor had not spread. There was no reason for him to attack the Chui family and the king of Shu. As a prince, doing such a thing was equivalent to rebelling. He raised his head and asked again, is it because the news that the king of Shu is not the biological son of his majesty has been announced? Emingzu shook her head again and suddenly asked, do you know that my mother had 2 other princes before me? Li Yi nodded and said, didn't those 2 princes die young? Speaking of this, he seemed to understand something and asked, concubine Chui? 20 years ago, the Chui family was extremely powerful. Not only did they dominate the imperial court, but they also had spies in the imperial palace. At that time, concubine Chui gave birth to a prince, and my mother successively lost 2 princes. After giving birth to me, she couldn't have any more children. Naturally, the king of Shu was the prince most likely to inherit the throne. It was not difficult for Li Yi to imagine why the Chui family and concubine Chui would do such a thing. The empress had no princes, so the first in line to inherit the throne would naturally be the son of concubine Chui, who was second only to the empress. The struggle for favor in the imperial court was no less cruel and bloody than the struggle in the imperial court. In order to fight for the throne, 2 princes were killed. Concubine Chui was definitely not the only one who would do such a thing. Over the years, my father has vigorously supported the poor and gradually reversed the situation in the imperial court. Besides purging the imperial court, he has also been investigating the case of that year. It wasn't until a few days ago that Louis found sufficient evidence. After Li Mingzhu finished speaking, all the guesses and suspicions in Li Yi's heart, as well as all the unclear lines, finally became clear. No wonder the old emperor never liked the king of Shu and the Chui family. No wonder Lu Yi was always mysterious. There was a hidden meaning in his words, but he didn't dare to say it out. No wonder the king of Shu, as the eldest son of the emperor, had never been conferred as the Eastern Palace. No wonder he and Emingzu felt that the old emperor and Prince Ning were hiding something from them. No wonder before they knew that the king of Shu was not the biological son of the old emperor, They felt that he was not the biological son of the old emperor. Even without the matter of the king of Shu, the Cui family wouldn't have the last laugh, because there would always be such a knife waiting for them on the road ahead. The difference was whether the saber was struck early or late, and whether it would hurt the saber itself when the saber was struck. Li Yi finally understood why the old emperor had been so supportive of his work of attacking the Cui family and the king of Shu. Because over the years, under the efforts of him and Emingzu, the power of the Cui family had gradually weakened. Until a few days ago, the Cui family had almost become a commander without an army. It was as easy and effortless as cutting tofu. He thought for a while and asked again, what about the matter of the king of Shu? For them, concubine Cui could only give birth to a prince. Just in case, the Cui family bribed the midwife and palace maids in advance, and sent a newborn baby boy into the palace. Emingzi shook her head and said, concubine Cui did give birth to a prince, but the prince died as soon as he was born. The king of Shu was the baby boy that the Cui family secretly sent into the palace. She picked up the teacup and said, after the king of Shu escaped and all the people of the Cui family were escorted to the capital, Cui Qingzi knew that there was no hope, so he confessed everything. The imperial palace was heavily guarded. It was as difficult as ascending to heaven to send a baby boy into the palace quietly and exchange it with the prince born by the concubine. The Cui family could even do this, so it was absolutely not an injustice for them to end up like this. He raised his head and asked, these things can't be easily done by the Cui family alone, can they? After today, how many people will be dealt with in the capital? Emingzu put down the teacup and said, those who should be dealt with have been dealt with. Li Yi was puzzled for a moment, but he understood immediately. By now, almost all the forces related to the Cui family had been wiped out. There was probably no fish that could escape the net. He had thought of many possibilities before, but he didn't expect the truth to be so complicated. This time, the Cui family had completely fallen, and their forces in the court had been completely purged. The king of Shu also couldn't wait for him to return to the capital. He looked at Emingzu and saw the confusion in her eyes. Without the Cui family and the king of Shu, they had no opponents. What should they do now? Life suddenly lost its direction, just like a salted fish that had lost its dream. In the courtyard, Mississippi Lu was wiping the tears in her eyes and glancing at the closed door from time to time. Chapter 929. The fall of the Cui family and the escape of the king of Shu gave Li Yi the feeling of a fist that had gathered its strength and was about to swing, but suddenly lost its target. If they had known that the old emperor had planned to flip the table, they would not have made the unnecessary move of knocking on the doors of the nobles. Assassinating the legitimate son of the royal family, and pretending to be the eldest son of the emperor. Unlike the crime of the Green Ruler, if these two crimes were made public, although they would still cause a great commotion, the old emperor would not lose too much face. He was an emperor, and he was also a man. For a man, what could be more humiliating than wearing a green hat on his head? But thinking about it carefully, it could not be said that they had made unnecessary moves. If not for this incident, the capital would have been in even greater turmoil. Only by smoothing out the source of the turmoil in advance could the people and the court be stabilized. The fall of the Cui family was a good thing, but it also brought a new problem. The throne had to be inherited. It was said that women's thoughts were difficult to guess, but Li Yi felt that men's thoughts were even more difficult to guess. Who did the old emperor want to pass the throne to? Why did he hide it so well? Emingzu thought for a long time before looking at him and saying, let nature take its course in the future. Li Yi knew the hesitation and struggle in her heart. In fact, she had not really made up her mind. Once she embarked on that path, there would be no lack of blood, and the person she would have to face in the end was her father. Li Yi nodded and did not say anything more. If she could not overcome the obstacle in her heart, no matter how hard others tried, it would be of no use. Fortunately, things were different now. After the fall of the Cui family and the loss of hope for the king of Shu, their situation was much better than before. After seeing off the eldest princess, he paced in the courtyard to relieve the depression in his heart. He had been full of energy and had made preparations for everything, but the Cui family had suffered a setback. It was difficult to release the energy in his heart, and it was very uncomfortable. Seeing him pacing back and forth in the courtyard with a gloomy face, Xiao Huan came over and asked with concern, "Son-in-law, what's wrong?" Li Yi sat down by the stone table and shook his head, saying, "There's always a feeling of having energy but nowhere to use it. You have the strength but nowhere to use it." On the opposite side, Mississippi Lu had finished wiping her eyes and sheathed her sword. She looked up at him and asked, "Can I help you?" Li Yi looked at the expression on her face and replied without any hesitation, "No need." Mississippi Lu stood up and waved her hand. "We're family. You're welcome," Li Yi said with an extremely solemn expression. "There's really no need. I have the strength but nowhere to use it. It's so uncomfortable to hold it in. I'll just vent it out. I don't have anything to do now anyway. I really don't need to trouble you." It was very strange. Maybe because of her reminder, Li Xian came over. When Mississippi Lu went out, she didn't forget to bring autumn water with her. "Have you heard? The entire Cui family has been escorted to the capital." Looking at his excited and shocked expression, Li nodded and said, "I heard. Emingzu just told me." "Why? You don't even know what your father has done?" Li Xian shook his head and sat down to drink a cup of tea. He said, "Father didn't tell me when he left. How would I know?" After saying this, a curious expression appeared on his face. He asked, "What should we do next?" Li was puzzled. "What should we do? The Cui family has fallen, and the king of Shu has fled to escape punishment. This is our best chance." Li Xian looked at him and frowned. "Take advantage of this opportunity to rope in the court officials and befriend the family of generals. Let Emingzu move forward." He looked at Li Yi and asked with some dissatisfaction, "How can you be a military advisor if you don't seize this kind of opportunity?" Li Yi had discovered a long time ago that Li Xian was absolutely warm-hearted. If Emingzu was the calm emperor, then he must be the anxious eunuch by the emperor's side. It was a pity that when it came to being an emperor, those who should be anxious were not anxious. It was useless for those who should not be anxious to be anxious. Li Yi shook his head and said, "Why don't you talk to Emingzu? Emingzu only listens to you." Li Xian took another sip of tea and looked at him. He asked, "Sit down and talk. Are you tired of standing?" Li Yi rubbed his butt and said, "It's okay. I like to stand." These days, the capital was in a constant state of turmoil. Drama after drama was played out. Families fell one after another and rose up, including the Cui family, the Qin family, and the Chen family. They were either destroyed or declined. The degree of excitement was so great that even the new show in the brothel couldn't compare to it. Compared to these shocking things, the fact that the Qin family's young Duke Qin had absconded out of fear of punishment for kidnapping a woman, and had yet to be arrested and brought to justice was not so important. These days, the Qin family was much more deserted. It was not only because autumn had arrived and the leaves had withered and fallen, but also because the world had become desolate. The most important reason was because 4 of the 5 Qin brothers had been imprisoned in recent days, and their families had been separated, now that Prime Minister Qin had fallen ill. The Qin family had dismissed some of the servant girls and servants. The entire estate was even less lively. Fifth Lord. "Hello, Fifth Lord." "Greetings, Fifth Lord." 2 figures walked out from the depths of the small path. Along the way, the Qin family servants who met them hurriedly bowed. Wu Er swept a withered leaf off the shoulder of a middle-aged man in front of him and asked, "Fifth Lord, are we still going to the brothel to watch the show today?" "Yes." The Qin family's Fifth Lord nodded and said, "But it's not the brothel. Let's go somewhere else today." Outside the capital, by a desolate river. The river was overgrown with weeds and few people were there. The reeds were as tall as a person. A broken wooden boat was anchored there. No one knew how long it had been there. In the canopy of the wooden boat, a person lay limp there like a puddle of mud. His hair was unkempt and his face was dirty. His clothes were ragged, and his limbs were bent at a strange angle. If it weren't for the hair that covered his face still moving rhythmically, no one would think he was a living person. However, he really was a living person. He bit a piece of porcelain in his mouth. He bent down and laboriously cut the rope in his hand. The sound of footsteps came from outside. He put the porcelain piece into his mouth, and stared ahead with lifeless eyes. A beam of light appeared in the canopy, because someone had lifted the heavy curtain, and walked in from outside. He ignored the stench in the canopy, walked to Qin Yu's side, and crouched down. The Qin family has fallen to such a state. He looked at Qin Yu and said in a small voice, "This is what you've always wanted, right?" A glimmer of emotion finally appeared in Qin Yu's turbid eyes. "Your mother's death back then, I was powerless." The Qin family's fifth lord looked at him and said, "I am only Qin Wu. Before me, there was still Qin Yi, Qin Air, Qin San, and Qin Si. It's not up to me to decide these things. Although you are very pitiful." He looked into his eyes and said, "But this is not a reason for you to do other things." After whispering a few words, he stood up and looked at Qin Yu. He asked, "These days have been very hard, haven't they?" "I won't in the future." He shook his head. As he walked out of the canopy, he turned his head and said, "We will meet again in the next life." In the river, the wooden boat flowing downstream ignited into a raging fire. The flames soared into the sky. Chapter 930. A few figures stood by the river, watching the fire that soared into the sky gradually disappear downstream. A burly man suddenly said, "Fifth Master, should we send someone to follow him and have a look? If he can survive, it can be considered his good fortune." The middle-aged man shook his head and said, "What's more, he is a member of the Qin family after all. It's not a big deal for him to die in the hands of a member of the Qin family. How can you say it's good fortune?" The burly man scratched his head and said, "If we let him escape, what if he comes back in a few years or decades to take revenge? That's how it is in the opera. After suffering all kinds of humiliation, he will endure the humiliation and finally put on a show of revenge. Opera is just opera. Endure the humiliation and revenge. How can it be as simple as you make it out to be?" The burly man scratched his head and said, "Why do I feel that this kind of trick has appeared in more than just opera?" The middle-aged man thought about it and said, "Let's send someone to have a look." The Supreme Court's prison. There were many prisons in the capital city. Ordinary criminals could be locked up in the prisons of the county government and the prefectural government. Only when there were major cases or extremely vicious criminals would the Ministry of Justice take action. If the case involved officials and nobles in the capital city, it would usually be handed over to the Supreme Court. The people involved in the case of the Cui family and the King of Shu were locked up in the Supreme Court's prison. In front of the Supreme Court, the Chancellor, who had just received the news, hurriedly came out and bowed. "Your Highness, Your Highness, Your Highness, and Lordly. At ease." "Thank you, Princess." Li Yi and the other two did not come to the Cui family to laugh at them. Although Cui Qingze had confessed all the crimes, many details of the case still needed to be investigated. Li Yi and the others just followed Lu Yidong to have a look. After all, the Cui family was locked up in the prison, an opponent they had been fighting against for years. In the prison, there was a lot of wailing. When they passed through the prison, the sound was even more ear-piercing, as if it was going to pierce through their eardrums. It was only when they entered the innermost cell that the voices gradually became softer. Cui Qingming, who had just taken over the Cui family, was no longer as high-spirited as before. He was wearing a white prison uniform, his hair was disheveled, and his face was dirty. He was chained to the cell. When the cell door opened, he raised his head to take a look, but quickly lowered it again. There was no expression on his face. Cui Qingming was a sinister and ruthless person. In order to achieve his goals, he would not hesitate to use any means. If he didn't meet an opponent who would flip the table at the slightest disagreement, he could barely be considered as a treacherous hero. His mouth was also extremely tight. No matter how Lu Yizhong asked, he did not reveal a single word. An official from the Supreme Court could not help but say in a low voice, "Sir, to deal with such stubborn criminals, torture is the most effective way." Lu Yi waved his hand. "Take me to Cui Qingze's cell." Cui Qingze was the former head of the Cui family. He knew as much as Cui Qingming, but his temperament was not like Cui Qingming's, so he was a good breakthrough point. Lu Yi had always adhered to the principle of not using torture, unless it was absolutely necessary. When he broke this principle, he would definitely leave an unforgettable memory for the criminal he was interrogating. County Marquis Li. When they walked out of the cell, Cui Qingming suddenly opened his mouth and said, Li Yi, Emingzu and Li Xian turned around at the same time. Cui Qingming still lowered his head and said no more. Li Yi looked at them and said, You go first. Be careful. Emingzu looked at him a little, nodded, and turned to leave. Li Xian's face was full of curiosity. Cui Qingming clearly wanted to say something only to Li Yi, but if he wanted to say it, he did not want to say it in front of him. The fire of curiosity burned in his heart, but he could only leave with Emingzu. Li Yi walked in front of Cui Qingming. He still did not raise his head and said in a low voice, That thing, it was you who did it, right? Li Yi didn't know which incident he was talking about, but the things that happened to the Cui family, which one of them wasn't his doing. No matter which incident Cui Qingming was talking about, he wouldn't be wrongly accused. Cui Qingming raised his head slightly. More than 40 dignitaries were kidnapped by you. Forcing the king of Shu to leave the capital was also your doing. The downfall of the Yu family and the Chu family was driven by you behind the scenes. It was you who turned Liuli into glass and almost shook the foundation of the Cui family. I never thought that even Xing Shichen. I'm afraid that you have something on him. Li Yi shook his head. You really misunderstood this. Lord Sung did it voluntarily. That's called abandoning darkness for light. Abandoning darkness for light? These words can only deceive a 3-year-old child. Cui Qingming smiled disdainfully. What is light and what is darkness? Winner is king and loser is thief. The winner is light and the loser is dark. Li Yi looked down at him. You called me here just to say this? A smile suddenly appeared on Cui Qingming's face. Do you really think that you have one? Li Yi did not speak because he knew that Cui Qingming had not finished speaking. I admit that you are very powerful. If His Highness the King of Shu had not provoked you, the Cui family and himself would not have fallen into this situation today. Cui Qingming shook his head and said, You have indeed done it. Step by step, you have pushed the King of Shu further and further away from that position. You have pulled out the tendons of the Cui family one by one. You can control what the people say and what they do. You can make all the officials and dignitaries in the capital unable to sleep well. You can force the eldest prince out of the capital. In front of you, the century-old families are nothing but chickens and dogs. But do you really think that you have one? Although your surname is Li, you are not that Li. Cui Qingming sneered and the expression on his face immediately became ferocious. He said in a cold tone, The more you win now, the worse you will lose in the future. How many days does His Majesty have left? Even if the King of Shu cannot ascend to the throne, there will always be other princes to replace him. How can they tolerate people like you appearing in the capital, in the Jing Kingdom? The day the new emperor ascends to the throne will be the day you die. And there is the eldest princess. Haha. Do you think that you will be safe with the protection of the eldest princess? After a few days, she will not even be able to protect herself. How can she protect you? The sneer on his face gradually turned into a wild laughter. Li Yi, County Marquis Li, Dr. Li. I will wait for you in the underworld. Going early doesn't mean that you are doing well. Li Yi looked at him and shook his head. He said, It is not easy to build a foundation in the underworld. Guarding it well is the right way. Don't wait for me. Li Xian leaned on the wall outside a prison cell and muttered, The relationship of the Cui family is really messy. The third son of the Cui family actually has an affair with the eldest sister-in-law. Although Lu Yi was investigating a serious case, there would always be some indecent things mixed in a serious case. He only asked a servant of the Cui family to point out the crimes of the Cui family in order to reduce the punishment. But he didn't expect that such a scandal would break out. He was surprised for a while and looked at Emingzu. He saw that she was staring at the front in a daze. She seemed to be in a trance. He doubtfully asked, Emingzu, what are you looking at? Emingzu. A hand was swaying in front of her eyes. Emingzu finally came back to her senses. She shook her head and said, It's nothing. I was thinking about something. Li Yi walked out of the prison cell in the distance. Li Xian hastily ran over and curiously asked, What did Cui Qingming say to you? He said that he will not be able to escape this time. He asked me to burn more paper money for him. Why? Li Xian curled his lips and said, "It is not your turn to burn paper money. Just don't burn it. He has no clothes to wear and no money to spend in the underworld." Mingzu looked at Li Yi. Her lips slightly opened as if she wanted to say something. But in the end, she didn't say anything. Li Yi smiled and didn't continue this topic. He casually pointed to another area in the prison and asked, "It is noisy over there. Who are the people locked up there?" An official of the Supreme Court hurriedly stepped forward and said, "Those are the officials of Shu Prefecture who surrendered to the king of Shu. They followed him and did a lot of evil things. After we finish dealing with the Cui family, we will deal with them." Chapter 931. The case of the Cui family and the king of Shu was the most influential and large-scale case in the Jing kingdom in the past few decades. Not only were dozens of officials and nobles in the capital city imprisoned, but the officials in Shuzhou who were involved in the case were also escorted to the capital city and locked up in the Supreme Court's prison. In one night, they were reduced from high and mighty officials to prisoners. No one knew what awaited them. If they were only to resign, it would be a blessing in disguise. Even if they were exiled to the army, it would not be a difficult thing to accept. However, if they were too deeply involved with the king of Shu, they would be sent directly to the guillotine. If that happened, there would really be nothing left. At this time, in a cell somewhere in the heavenly prison, a young man clutched his abdomen. Cold sweat seeped from his forehead, and his body trembled. Xian, what's wrong with you?" In the cell next door, a woman's face was full of anxiety. She tightly grasped the bars in the middle and asked with concern. The young man's forehead was full of cold sweat, but he raised his head and smiled as he waved his hand, saying, "It's nothing, it's just an old problem." The woman looked at the young man who was sweating profusely, turned her head, and with a thud, she knelt down and said in a hoarse voice, "Sir, Xian's stomach is not good. Please don't give him moldy food anymore." The officer looked back and said expressionlessly, "It's already come to this, why are you still being picky?" The woman weakly collapsed to the ground. In another cell, someone disdainfully mocked, "This is the Supreme Court's heavenly prison. If you want to eat well, I'm afraid you'll only get that last meal." In the Jing kingdom, no matter where the prison was, there was an unwritten rule. Before the execution, prisoners could enjoy a sumptuous meal, known as the last meal. This was in the hope that the prisoner could eat his fill and be reincarnated into a good family in the next life. The moment the prisoner ate the last meal, it meant that the prisoner was not far from the execution. As soon as that person's mocking voice fell, the sound of iron chains being lowered suddenly came from the door of a cell. A few prison guards opened the cell door and moved a set of tables and chairs in. Then someone brought in wine and delicacies. The smell of the wine and dishes could be smelled from far away. 8 dishes and 1 soup. The prisoner who had spoken just now counted and fell to the ground weakly. This aroma was not something that the moldy and rancid food they usually ate could compare to. Under what circumstances would the prison give the prisoner such preferential treatment? The last meal, this was the last meal. The last meal for the Jiang County lieutenant had arrived. Could it be far from theirs? The woman grabbed the railing with both hands and said in a panic, Xian, Lord Jiang, please." 2 jailers helped the young man up and sat him down at the table. Jiang Xian stared blankly at the sumptuous meal in front of him, but he had no appetite at all. Just now, when his stomach hurt, he thought that if he could have a full meal, it would be worth it even if he died. Men were always fickle. He was already regretting it now. He didn't want good wine and good food, and he didn't want to have a full meal. Even if he had to eat moldy and rancid food every day, he would be willing. As long as he was alive, as long as he could live. Jiang Xian struggled to sit up and shook his head. I don't want to eat. Why, are these dishes not to Brother Jiang's taste? Li Yi walked into the cell and said in surprise, It doesn't matter. What do you want to eat, Brother Jiang? Just tell me, and I will ask someone to make it again. This voice was very familiar, so familiar that it was engraved in his bones. Jiang Xian turned his head and saw a figure walking into the cell. His whole body froze in place, as if he had been struck by lightning. Brother Li. Li walked into the cell and personally helped him to the table. He said with a smile, Brother Jiang, long time no see. Li Xian and Emingzu walked over side by side. When they saw this scene, they couldn't help but feel surprised. He had prepared such a sumptuous meal just for the person in front of them. They didn't have much impression of this person at all. Li Xian walked over and asked in confusion, You know each other? Li nodded. Very familiar. Brother Jiang and I. Li patted Jiang Ziyan's shoulder and said, Are friends who have gone through life and death together. Gone through life and death together. Li Xian murmured. When he looked at the young man, he immediately frowned. Li Yi pointed to the two people and introduced them to him. This is the eldest princess, and this is Crown Prince Li Xian. The eldest princess was in power, and Crown Prince Li Xian was in charge of the Academy of Sciences. How could Jiang Ziyan not have heard of these two people? He hurriedly got up and saluted. Greetings, eldest princess, greetings, your highness. Li looked at the woman in the next cell and asked, This is... Jiang Ziyan lowered his head and said, This is my wife. Li Yi was surprised and said, Brother Ziyan got married? When? Jiang Ziyan said, Just last year. Li looked back at a jailer, and the jailer immediately understood. He hurriedly ran over, opened the cell door, and invited the woman over. Ziyan, these people. The woman still didn't know what had happened. She was nervous and whispered. Jiang Ziyan hurriedly introduced them. This is Lord Li. This is the eldest princess, and this is Crown Prince. After another round of greetings, Jiang Ziyan and the woman didn't want to sit down at first. Li Yi persuaded them for a long time before they sat down nervously. Li Yi knew that Emingzu and Li Xian must be full of doubts now, so he briefly described what happened in Shuzhou to them. Their friendship was real. If it weren't for Jiang Ziyan, he and Rui wouldn't have been able to leave the city safely, and naturally, there wouldn't have been such a thing in the future. After knowing the inside story, Li Xian looked at Jiang Ziyan without the dissatisfaction in his eyes. Li looked back at the official of the Supreme Court and asked, What crime did he commit? The official of the Supreme Court looked bitter and said, He didn't commit any crime, but Lord Jiang is under the command of the King of Shu. Jiang Ziyan lowered his head. Sometimes one didn't need a specific crime to be convicted. It was normal to be implicated by following the wrong person. He looked at Li Yi with a hint of hesitation on his face. After a long time he said, Lord Li, Jiang Ziyan deserved to die. But for the sake of our past relationship, can you save my wife? She is innocent. Ziyan. The woman held his hand and said with a solemn expression, If you die, I will immediately follow you. Don't talk nonsense. I am a member of the Jiang family in life, and a ghost of the Jiang family in death. Then I will divorce my wife. At this point, it's too late for you to divorce. Li Yi's face was a little dark. He came over to reminisce about the old days, not to watch them show off their love. He coughed and said, These years, Brother Ziyan has suffered under the command of the King of Shu. Jiang Ziyan raised his head, and a trace of confusion appeared on his face. The woman had already understood the meaning behind Li Yi's words. She knelt on the ground and said repeatedly, Thank you, Lord Li, thank you, Lord Li. In the surrounding cells, the people smelled the fragrance and swallowed the rancid prison food. Although the last meal was delicious, they felt that the food that emitted the smell was even more delicious. That woman! What was the use of kowtowing? Could kowtowing be spared from the death penalty? At this moment, they only felt that if they could eat food like this in front of them for the rest of their lives, they would have nothing else to ask for. Chapter 932. Unlike the officials and nobles in the capital who had committed heinous crimes, the officials in Shuzhou who were implicated by the King of Shu were actually not all that evil. They might have plundered the wealth of the people and oppressed them, but their crimes did not warrant death. They could be spared from death, but their careers would probably be terminated. They would also suffer a lot of physical torture, which was inevitable. Although Li Yi and Jiang Ziyan once had some conflicts, that was a long time ago. When they were in Shuzhou, Jiang Ziyan had saved his and Rui's lives. Whether he was sincere or not, it was enough to let go of all the previous grievances. Seeing that Jiang Ziyan had fallen into such a situation, Li couldn't just stand by and watch. There are still some procedures to go through with the Supreme Judiciary and the Secret Intelligence Department. I'm afraid that Brother Jiang will suffer a lot in the next 2 days. Li stood up and looked at Jiang Ziyan saying, however, Brother Jiang will not suffer in vain. You have worked hard for the King of Shu for so many years, and the Imperial Court will definitely compensate you. Jiang Ziyan shook his head quickly saying, no. He was already very lucky to be able to walk out of here alive. He had never thought that he would not be implicated in this case and be restored to his post or even promoted. With the eldest princess here, everyone was very nervous and did not dare to say anything. After arranging Jiang Ziyan's affairs, Li did not stay any longer and said goodbye to them. After Li and the eldest princess left, an official of the Supreme Judiciary immediately changed his expression. He glared at several jailers beside him and said, "Hey you guys, what are your eyes doing? Hurry up and clean up this place for Mr. Jiang." No one had expected that there was such a person hidden in this group of criminal officials. He was a sworn friend of County Marquis Li, and a spy hidden around the King of Shu. If he got out of here in the future, he would have a meteoric rise. Although he could not get Mr. Jiang out of here, it was still possible to improve the living environment of the prison cell. Here, clean this place up. Clean the bucket, change the bucket every 2 hours, and bring a new quilt over. Then he looked at the woman who was holding Jiang Daren's hand. He rolled his eyes and said, "Jiang Daren, I'm really sorry. Recently the prison has been tight. Why don't you and Madame Jiang stay in the same cell for the next 2 days? Jiang Ziyan could naturally feel the kindness of the official of the Supreme Judiciary. He nodded and said, "Thank you very much, Your Excellency." The official of the Supreme Judiciary smiled and said, "You are welcome." Very soon, the entire cell was clean and spotless. The single bed was replaced by a double bed. The quilt on the bed was also brand new. Even the cell was surrounded by curtains that could be drawn down at any time. It was like an independent little world. Beside the bed, the young woman held Jiang Ziyan's hand and asked in confusion, "Husband, what's going on between you and Master Li?" Jiang Ziyan sighed, and a trace of reminiscence appeared on his face. He said, "It was an autumn day 3 years ago. I had just become a jinshi. I was full of passion and high spirits. That day, Prince Ning held a banquet in his manor, and invited all the jinshi of Qing and prefecture. Then I met him. And then? Then I was sent to the remote Shuzhou." Jiang Ziyan sighed and murmured, "It's either a blessing or a misfortune. It's really hard to tell." In the other cells, everyone looked at the isolated area with envy. He really didn't expect the Supreme Court's heavenly prison to be so attentive. Not to mention the sumptuous last meal. There was actually such obvious preferential treatment. There was food, a bed, and a woman. This didn't seem like a prison, however. Thinking that this might be his last day of enjoyment, no one envied him anymore. It was just a temporary happiness. Maybe tomorrow he would have to face a knife on his head. They just put their ears to the wall and listened quietly, and listened. Louis still had to collect evidence with the people of the Supreme Court. These days they ate and lived here. Li and the other two went around the heavenly prison, and walked out of the Supreme Court. The King of Shu ran away, and the Cui family is finished. It's really hard to accept. Li Xian sighed and asked, "Emingzu, what should we do next?" Emingzu walked with her head down, and didn't respond. Li Xian looked back at her. Emingzu. Emingzu came back to her senses and looked at him. She nodded and said, "Yes, you're right." Li Xian was stunned and asked doubtfully, "What did I say just now?" "I still have some things to deal with. I'll go back to the palace first," Emingzu said and strode away. Li Xian looked at her back and touched his chin that didn't have a beard. He said, "She has something on her mind." Li counted on his fingers and said, "Women have a few days every month. She'll be fine in a few days." Li Xian didn't continue this topic. He suddenly asked, "Has your butt healed?" Li looked back at him and said with a frown, "My butt has always been fine. I saw it when I went to your house the other day." He shook his head and looked at Li. He said pitifully, "I think, compared to you taking her down, it'll be easier for her to take you down." Yunqi village was a village dozens of miles away from the capital. It relied on the mountains and the rivers. Yunqi village had its back to the mountains and water. The villagers mainly made a living by fishing and farming. Occasionally, they would go into the mountains to hunt and walk dozens of miles to the market in the capital to exchange for money. The rich people in the capital were very fond of the wild animals in the mountains. The village was remote and not close to the official road. For hundreds of years, the villagers of Yunqi village worked at sunrise and rested at sunset. Other than the daily buying and selling activities, they rarely interacted with the outside world. Of course, there were times when outsiders would pass by the village to rest and ask for a cup of water. The villagers usually didn't refuse. At this moment, under a large locust tree at the entrance of the village, a man wiped his mouth and praised, "There are mountains and water. This place is good." In front of him, a villager smiled honestly and said, "In our hearts, this place can't even compare to the capital." After saying this, he waved his hand at an old man who walked in from outside and asked, "Old man Lu, did you go into the mountains again?" The old man's legs seemed to be ill, and he couldn't walk steadily. He had a bamboo basket on his back. He smiled and said, "I just picked some herbs. I didn't go very far." Watching the old man limp away, the villager smacked his lips and said, "Old Lu is also a pitiful man. He's old and it wasn't easy for him to have a daughter. Once, when he went to the city, she was defiled by the young master of a powerful family in Jingdo. Later, the girl jumped into the river. Old Lu went to the yamen to seek justice, but his leg was broken. The old woman at home fell ill from anger and still hasn't recovered." The big man shook his head and said, "He is indeed pitiful. However, the court has a policy for old people like this to go to the medical center built by Her Highness the eldest princess. They don't need to pay to see the doctor, and they don't need to pick their own herbs. Everyone in our village remembers Her Highness's kindness. If it weren't for Her Highness's medical center, this old woman would have died long ago. However, picking herbs is not for his old woman. A few days ago, old man Lu picked up a person from the river. That person's hands and feet were all broken, and his body was badly burned. Old man Lu was picking herbs for him." The villager's expression became angry as he cursed, "This King world. Good people really don't have good rewards, good people don't live long, and evil people who do evil live more freely than anyone else." The big man finished drinking and patted him on the shoulder. He comforted him. "Good and evil will be rewarded. Heavens will reincarnate. Evil people will definitely get their retribution." In a dilapidated courtyard, just as the old man walked through the door, an old woman walked out and said excitedly, "He's awake, he's awake." The old man didn't have time to put down the medicine basket on his back. He limped into the house and came to the bed. A figure on the bed had already opened his eyes. There were large burns on his exposed skin, and most of his hair was burned. His limbs were strangely bent, and there was still a trace of trance in his eyes. The old man staggered over and said with a smile, "You're finally awake." The person on the bed said in a hoarse voice, "Did you save me?" The old man nodded. "Ah yes, I found you by the river that day. Where is your house? I'll send someone to send a message." The man thought for a moment and said, "Help me send a message to Prime Minister Qin's residence. Tell him that Qin Yu is here. Remember, you must personally tell Prime Minister Qin this." The old man was stunned and asked with a trembling voice, "Qin? Qin Yu?" After saying that, he seemed to think of something. He took a deep breath, looked at him and asked, Are you the missing young Duke Qin? As long as you help me with this matter, I will definitely reward you generously in the future." The old man looked at him and asked, Are you really young Duke Qin?" The person on the bed didn't speak again. It was obvious that he had tacitly agreed. "Qin Yu, young Duke Qin." The old man closed his eyes, clenched his fists, and slowly loosened them. He put down the medicine basket on his back, turned his head and whispered, "Old woman, go close the door." Not long after, outside the door, the big man scratched his head and said in surprise, "It's broad daylight. Why are you closing the door?" Chapter 933. Thump, thump, thump. The already broken wooden door, under the external force, made a rhythmic tremble, dust rustling down. After a long time, the sound of footsteps came from the courtyard. The footsteps were very slow, stopping and pausing, indicating that the owner of the footsteps was walking very slowly. After a long time, an old voice came from the other side of the door. "Who is it?" "It's me." A rough voice came from outside the door. "You are De Zhuang from the east side of the village?" "Yes, I am De Zhuang." Old Man Liu, quickly open the door. The sound of a wooden bolt being moved came from inside. The wooden door creaked open, and an old face peeked out from inside. Seeing the unfamiliar man outside the door, the old man was startled and blurted out, "You are not De Zhuang." A trace of panic appeared on his face, and he hurriedly closed the wooden door. The big man stretched out a hand and gently pushed against the wooden door, and the wooden door could no longer close. "Sir, this is not right." The big man looked at him, shook his head and said, "It's broad daylight right now, and there are so many people in the village. There are 3 people squatting under the tree opposite, and I can't do anything to you. Even if I'm not De Zhuang, you don't have to be so panicked. Aren't you exposing yourself here?" Seeming to realize the problem with the big man's words, the expression on the old man's face regained some calmness, and he asked, "Who are you and why are you pretending to be De Zhuang?" The big man looked at him, smiled and said, "Is young Duke Qin inside?" The old man's expression changed again, and he suddenly shook his head and immediately said, "I don't know any young Duke Qin, and I don't know what you are talking about. If you don't leave, I'll call for help. You've exposed yourself again." The big man looked at him and said helplessly, "Even if you don't know young Duke Qin, you can just tell me. Why are you acting so agitated, as if you're afraid that I know him, and you're closing the door and calling for help? Aren't you clearly telling me that young Duke Qin is inside?" After saying this, the old man's face was already pale and bloodless. The burly man sighed and said, "Although young Duke Qin is not a good person, he is still surnamed Qin. Even if he dies, he can't just casually die outside." Seeing the old man's face turn even paler and his body tremble uncontrollably, the large man was stunned for a moment and asked in disbelief, "He can't really be dead, right?" The old man's body trembled even more violently. A moment later, the burly man looked at the old man and said with a conflicted expression, "A dead one is fine too." Young Duke Qin of the Qin clan, who had fled to avoid punishment, had returned. However, he was carried back. When he was carried back, he had already lost all signs of life. According to the coroner's examination, the corpse's 4 limbs, no, all 5 limbs were broken. His entire body was covered in burns, and there were countless knife wounds all over his body. He was almost like a sieve. One could imagine the inhumane torture this little duke had suffered before he died. There was no way to solve this case. The body was found by a riverbank 10 li away from Jingdo. It had been soaked in the water for a long time, and had long changed beyond recognition. No clues could be found. If it were not for the jade pendant he had on him that proved his identity, the bailiffs of the Yamen would not have recognized him as young Duke Qin. The Qin family had just experienced a great change. Now, they had to hold a funeral. Prime Minister Qin, the old sending off the black, could be said to be extremely tragic. When the people of Jingdo learned of this matter, they were also affected by this sorrowful atmosphere. Every household was decorated with lanterns and banquets. The atmosphere was very lively. The biggest wastrel in Jingdo would finally no longer harm people. The people no longer had to be on edge. Even some minor nobles dared to let their wives and concubines go out. Nothing could compare to this joyous event. In the Qin family, the servants wore plain mourning clothes. The 5th master of the Qin family supported Prime Minister Qin, and slowly walked into the mourning hall. After the 2 of them walked in, everyone in the mourning hall left one by one. Prime Minister Qin's expression was calm. There was no sadness or joy on his face. It was just that his originally straight back, after bending, could no longer straighten it. He supported Prime Minister Qin to sit down and said softly, "Father, your health is not good. Don't be too sad." Prime Minister Qin raised his head and looked at him. He asked, "Did you do it yourself?" Hearing this, Qin's body stiffened. He quickly relaxed and shook his head. "No. Prime Minister Qin refused Qin He's support and stood up from the chair. He slowly walked out of the morning hall and looked back. The eldest son of the Qin family was now lying in the coffin in the middle. He turned his head again. The once prosperous Qin family only had one son left of the 5 sons. The next generation was either affected by their fathers or brought back to their parents' home because they were too young. The Qin family now only had 2 people left. It could no longer be called a family. He wanted to look up at the sky and laugh, but he could only make a sound like a broken bellow. Haha, this old man's whole life, this whole life. Li Yi was reading a poem. It was a poem written by Mississippi Lu. He never knew that Mississippi Lu could actually write poems. She had only started reading for a short period of time. He was afraid that she could not even recognize all the words. This jump was really too big. The second young lady of the Lu clan stood beside him and asked, "Is his handwriting ugly?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "Not at all. If your writing is ugly, there is no good writing in the world." He said this not only because he wanted to flatter Mississippi Lu. Mississippi Lu might not be able to recognize all the words, read articles, or write poems, but she could write good writing that countless people would envy. For a master like her, if she could not even control her body, she would not dare to go out and brag about her ranking on the heaven list. What's more, her handwriting was very similar to the one she usually used. Wouldn't it be like slapping her own face if she said that her writing was bad? An imperceptible joy appeared on Mississippi Lu's face, and she asked, "Really not ugly?" Li Yi said seriously, "Really not ugly, I swear to God." Mississippi Lu breathed a sigh of relief. "That's good. I found your old handwriting and copied it. I was still worried. It's just that the tone is wrong. There's no mood, no rhythm, and no rhyme. In terms of words, you need to think about it." Li Yi frowned and looked at Mississippi Lu, and said, "Rui, I think you should focus on practicing your sword. If you don't believe me, look up and see who the heavens have forgiven." Li Yi ran around the courtyard, and as he ran, he turned back to warn second young mistress Lu. "Qingyu has committed many evil deeds, and now he's dead. You know how tragic his death was. If you continue to treat me like this, when the day comes that my martial arts surpasses yours, I promise, I will repay you 10 times, 100 times for what you've done to me today." Mississippi Lu held autumn water and looked at him coldly. She followed behind him at a steady pace. "I've decided to listen to your advice and practice my sword." Mississippi Lu's autumn water was out of its scabbard. Things could not be more serious. Seeing Rui standing at the door, Li Yi quickly said, Rui, don't just look, take care of her." Rui smiled and walked into the room with Li Duan in her arms. Li Yi looked at the sloppy old man leaning against the tree and said, "Su, 10 chicken legs, help me stop her." The sloppy old man raised his head and glanced at him, then looked away again, focusing his attention on the little yellow book in his hand. In the entire courtyard, there were only 2 people who were more powerful than Mississippi Lu. One didn't care about the relationship between husband and wife, and the other didn't care about the morality of the martial world. Mississippi Lu's butt would swell when her hands and feet landed on it, and when autumn water landed on it, her butt would be gone. Her butt was more important, and it was best to escape. He channeled all his true yuan to the soles of his feet, and his whole body turned into a shadow, disappearing from where he stood, heading straight for the direction of the courtyard's entrance. Bang! Unexpectedly, he bumped into a figure, and Li Yi staggered. He looked at the eldest princess who was standing at the door, clutching her chest, frowning slightly, and looking at him with dissatisfaction. His expression changed and he asked with concern, "Are you all right? Where did you bump into? Does it hurt? Do you want me to massage it for you?" Chapter 934. Li Yi was surprised himself. It wasn't like he didn't know what he was capable of, so how could he have bumped into the eldest princess? With her martial arts and alertness, no matter how sudden it was or how fast he was, it was impossible for her to not be able to dodge in time. Unless she was really too absent-minded. So absent-minded that she didn't even notice that someone had bumped into her. He naturally knew how fast he was just now. Even he felt pain when he bumped into her, not to mention the delicate eldest princess. Therefore, the first thing he did was ask her where she had bumped into. Did it hurt? Did she need him to help rub it? However, what was with the 3 inexplicable chills he felt from the front, the back, and the door? Was there anything wrong with not running away after bumping into someone and showing proper concern? Compared to those people who ran away after the accident, her personality was many times more noble. Li looked at the eldest princess and said in a concerned voice, "I'm sorry, I ran too fast just now. Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Emingzu covered her chest with one hand and shook her head, but her brows were still slightly knitted. No wonder it felt so soft just now. Li realized where he had bumped into and he couldn't help feeling even more worried. After several months of hard work, the eldest princess' chest finally had a bit of improvement. It could even be said that it was just beginning to take shape. If it was knocked back by this, wouldn't he be committing a great sin? Wouldn't he be ruining this girl's life? Out of a man's sense of responsibility, he had to take responsibility for her to the end. When there were outsiders around, Mississippi Lou's personality was completely put away. She didn't want others to think that she was a violent woman, especially not Emingzu. She could read and write poems. She was also skilled in both literature and martial arts, not any worse than Emingzu. When she sat down at the table, the eldest princess put her hand down from her chest. When Li looked at her carefully, he found that she was very different from before. Although her clothes were as neat as before, and her hair was not disheveled, her complexion was much more haggard than a few days ago. She seemed to be extremely exhausted, and this exhaustion was not shown on the outside but on the inside. In the past, when she stood next to Second Miss Lu, the only thing that she could compare to Second Miss Lu was her luxurious temperament and her equally good looks. Now her temperament was gone and her beauty was gone. Although her haggard appearance gave her a different feeling, it was a beauty that only a few people like him could appreciate. Li was really worried this time and asked, "What's wrong? Why is your face so bad?" She was not like this even during the busiest times of the imperial court. Even if she had a few special days, she should not be so haggard. Li Mingzhu shook her head and said, "It's nothing. It should be because I haven't slept well these days." She casually picked up a piece of paper on the table and looked at it. She said, "Who wrote this poem? The words are okay, but the poem is a complete mess." Ignoring Li Yi's strenuous winking at her, she shook her head and continued, "The tone is wrong, the mood is completely absent, and even the rhythm is not understood." Li Yi rubbed his eyes and leaned back on the chair, covering his face with his hands. The eldest princess had received royal education since she was young. It could be said that she was skilled in both literature and martial arts. All in all, she should be the most outstanding woman in the entire Jing Kingdom, no in the surrounding countries. In her opinion, Mississippi Lou's poem was no different from a child's play. However, the truth was one thing, and saying it was another. If this matter could be brought up, her chest wouldn't be hurting now. "We haven't sparred for a long time." Mississippi Lou picked up autumn water and said, "Let's spar." Okay. The two of them never refused each other's challenges. Perhaps the eldest princess, who was in a bad mood, also wanted to vent. She only spat out a word, stood up, and walked to the exclusive sparring field for the two of them in the inner court. Li Yi lay on the chair and looked at the blue sky. He didn't really want to watch the fight. Seeing her like this, the words Cui Qingming said in the imperial prison echoed in his ears again. Yes, although his surname was Li, it was not the Li of the royal family. Even if he was Emingzu, he could only be considered half a Li. No matter who the new emperor was, he or Emingzu would not be allowed to exist. This point he didn't need Cui Qingming's reminder. He had always been very clear. At first his thoughts were very straightforward. If there was no new emperor, these conflicts would not exist. However, the crux of the problem was Emingzu. She could participate in the affairs of the country. She could act as the representative of the court. And she could do anything the emperor could do. However, for her to truly sit on the throne, she still couldn't get over it. In the end, she couldn't get over the man lying in bed. Even if she didn't have any selfish motives and just wanted the country to become stronger and better, she couldn't change the fact that this was equivalent to treason. It was the same as treason against her own father. Even after he left, she couldn't do this with a clear conscience. This wasn't her fault. If she could really do this without any psychological pressure, she wouldn't be the Li Emingzu he knew. She wouldn't be the Li Emingzu he liked. "What are you thinking about, husband?" A soft voice came from behind him. Li got up from the chair and walked over. He pulled Rui's hand and sat down on the stone bench beside him. He said, "Something troubling me." Rui looked at him and asked, "It's been so long. Haven't you made a decision yet?" Li looked at her in surprise and shock. He asked, Decide what?" Rui smiled and said, "Although I don't know what my husband is hesitating about, this matter must be very important. Otherwise, my husband wouldn't have used more than 2 years and still haven't made a decision." Rui didn't like to talk like Xiao Huan and chatter. She also wasn't like Mississippi Lu, who spoke like gold. She always saw everything and remembered it. Some of Li Yi's subtle emotional changes could be hidden from Xiao Huan and Rui, but it couldn't be hidden from her. Rui leaned on his shoulder and murmured, "Is it hard to decide?" It wasn't just the eldest princess who found it hard to decide. Even Li Yi himself had never truly made up his mind. He sighed and said, "One step is the sky, one step is the earth. It's very difficult." Rui held his hand tightly and said, "No matter what happens in the future, I and Rui will accompany you to the heavens and the earth." With her words, Li didn't have anything to hesitate about. Whether it was to the heavens or the earth, he would always have Rui by his side. Mississippi Lu, forget about it. She would only beat him until he cried. Whether to advance or retreat, he decided to let Emingzu make the choice. He gently kissed Rui's face, stood up and walked towards the inner courtyard. In fact, he didn't think highly of the eldest princess in this competition. One was diligent enough to challenge him every day to improve her strength, while the other was always burdened by court affairs and neglected her martial arts. One advancing and one retreating, the gap between them quickly became apparent. Sure enough, the sound of their previous competition was bang bang bang, but now it became bang bang bang. Li passed through a moon gate and saw that the eldest princess was pressed down by Mississippi Lu. He raised his hand and quickly fell down, hitting a certain perky part of her body. That was how the sound of bang 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 came out. As he hit, he frowned and asked, "Do you submit? Do you submit? Do you submit?" Li Yi stood still, thought for a moment and asked, "Do you need my help?" Chapter 935. Help? How do you want to help? Mississippi Lu's raised hand stopped in the air, and she looked over. The Princess Royal's acupuncture point was sealed, and her pretty face was flushed. She stared at him with a murderous look. "Rui, what are you doing?" Li Yi walked over quickly, pulled Mississippi Lu away, and said, "Emingzu is a princess. How can you treat her like this? Let go of her." Mississippi Lu was pulled away by him. The murderous look in the Princess Royal's eyes dissipated, and there was a hint of apology. It turned out that the help he was talking about was to help himself. Li Yi secretly wiped away a cold sweat. Although he also wanted to try what it felt like to spank the butt of a princess who might become an empress in the future, it was just for the moment. There was still a long way to go to Rui. Just thinking about it made him tremble. After the Princess Royal was helped up by him, she still couldn't move. Li looked up and down, left and right, and asked, "Have your acupuncture points been sealed? Where was it? I'll help you unseal it." The Princess Royal's face turned red again, and she didn't say anything. Mississippi Lu came over, pushed him aside, and gently touched Mingzhu's chest. Although she was humiliated by Mississippi Lu, she didn't do anything drastic after her acupuncture points were unsealed. She got up and walked to the hot spring room, and said lightly, "I'm going to take a bath. Get me a change of clothes." Li followed Mississippi Lu to the front. She suddenly turned around and asked, "I'm going to get her a change of clothes, and I'm going to take a bath. Do you want to come with me?" Li hesitated. "I don't think that's a good idea." When Mississippi Lu began to roll up her sleeves, Li waved his hand and said, "I just took a bath this morning. I don't need it this time." After that, he turned around and walked in the direction he came from. After being spanked by Mississippi Lu, The Princess Royal took a shower and changed her clothes. She looked much more energetic than before. The clothes she was wearing belonged to Mississippi Lou. They were about the same age and height. She could wear whatever Mississippi Lou could wear, but Mississippi Lou might not be able to wear what she could. Lee noticed that Mississippi Lou's gaze kept drifting towards the Princess Royal's chest, and there was some doubt in her eyes. The relationship between the two of them was really strange to the extreme. They were enemies and friends at the same time. Lee couldn't figure it out, but there was one thing he was very clear about. The two of them were indeed getting closer. With the Princess Royal's character, she could actually act as if nothing had happened after being spanked. With their habits, they would actually take a bath together with each other. This made Li involuntarily think of Zue Mo and Ruoqing. What was wrong with the women around him? Emingzi tucked a strand of hair that was still a little wet at the temples behind her head. She looked up and asked, "Have the princes sent you invitations?" Li nodded and said, "There are quite a few." The ones who were the happiest about the King of Shu losing power were not him or the Princess Royal, but the princes who used to be below the King of Shu. In the past, the King of Shu had a respected status and had the support of the Cui family and many forces in the court. The other princes could not see any hope at all. Now that the King of Shu had fallen, wouldn't the throne be chosen from among them? Therefore, these days, the princes whose fiefdoms were close to the capital had already rushed back to the capital. Those whose fiefdoms were far away were also on their way back after receiving the news. Naturally, returning to the capital was not just to watch the show. Returning to the capital was to win over the officials and nobles, strengthen oneself, and accumulate chips for the future struggle for power. In the past few days, Li had already received several invitations to banquets. Of course, those invitations were now either lying at the bottom of the furnace or under the carriage. He was not the only one who made such a choice. Any official with status and some knowledge in the capital would not make a move to choose a side before the situation was clear. The struggle for the throne was not a game. If one chose the wrong side, it would not only implicate oneself in the future. Perhaps one's family would also be implicated. The previous wave of people who had chosen a side in advance had already died. Not only did they have to think for the country, but they also had to think for themselves. Li also had to think for himself. Think for Rui, think for Rui, think for Xiaohuan, think for Zemo, think for Ruoqing, think for many people. It was also a sin to be too outstanding. With the old emperor's protection, he had nothing to fear. Once the old emperor could not protect him, those so-called princes and princes, who called him brothers now, would after a while be righteous and raise the butcher's knife against their brothers. Emingzi knew him very well. After being together for so long, she knew better than him who was who and what people would do. If there was really a day when Emingzi faced him with a sword, then there would be nothing in this capital, this Jing kingdom, that was worth his nostalgia. Emingzi looked at him and said, "Burn it." "What?" Li looked at her and Mississippi Lou also looked at her. "Burn all those invitations," the eldest princess said in a low voice. The eldest princess said in a low voice. Then she looked up at him and said seriously, "I've decided." Mississippi Lou looked at her and asked, "What have you decided?" Li didn't ask because he knew what she had decided. He was a little curious and a little surprised. This question was actually what he was going to ask her. Before he asked, she had already given the answer. He looked at her face and asked seriously, "Have you really decided?" Her expression was equally serious. "I have decided. No regrets. No regrets." Li knew where the knot in her heart was. It was also the knot in his heart. If she couldn't get over it, she would never be able to make up her mind. That step was so difficult that the two of them had taken it for 2 years, but they still hadn't crossed it. What exactly happened that made her make such a decision in just a few days? Thoughts flew in his mind. After a moment he nodded, got up and said, "It's good that you have decided. I will send you back." Emingzi stood up and nodded. Mississippi Lou looked at them. She felt that although the three of them were sitting very close, she was so far away from them. She couldn't understand what they were saying, couldn't understand what they were doing. She felt that she was the outsider. Li sent the eldest princess out the door before turning his head. He looked at her and said, "That day in the celestial prison, what Cui Qingming said, did you hear it all?" She didn't deny it, which meant she admitted it. Li looked at her and sighed. He said, "Actually, you don't have to be like this. I really don't care. In the past, it was always you who did it for me." She stopped walking and looked at him. "Now, it's my turn to do it for you." The eldest princess, who had always walked the smart and capable path, suddenly began to be emotional. Li Yi was stunned and couldn't get used to it for a moment. That. Li Yi looked at her and thought for a moment. He said, "Even if you really want to do something, you have to tell me first. Don't let your imagination run wild. Look at how haggard you look these few days." The eldest princess shook her head and said, "It's all right. I can still hold on." "It's not a matter of whether you can hold on or not." Li shook his head and said seriously, "In the past, when you and Rui stood together, you were evenly matched. Now she has taken 70% of the advantage. You only have 30% left." When Li Mingzhu heard that, she was taken aback for a moment before she gave a faint smile. She turned around and attentively helped him adjust his collar. She asked, "Do you know why Lu Rui always likes to beat you up?" "Why?" Li immediately became spirited and asked curiously. This was something he had been puzzled about for a long time. He couldn't understand why the violent and savage Mississippi Lu didn't beat others but always beat him. In the end, he could only attribute it to the whole family. She couldn't beat Rui, and beating Xiaohuan would seem like bullying the weak. She could only bully him to get a little bit of psychological satisfaction. Emingzu helped him fix his collar. Then she clenched her fist again and said, "Because I also like." Chapter 936. If she liked him, then she liked him. If she liked him, then she should say it out loud. He would decide whether or not to accept her based on her performance in the future. She grabbed his collar just because she liked him. He almost suffocated to death. What kind of like was that? His collar was grabbed by her. When Li Yi walked back, he tidied his collar and ordered the gatekeeper, "Send an invitation to all the manners who sent the invitation. Tell them that I'm sick and can't go. If you don't want to go, then don't go." Telling others that you're not going was basic etiquette. He straightened his collar and tidied his clothes before walking into the courtyard. Otherwise, Mississippi Lu might think that he did something else when he sent Emingzi back. He didn't mind, but what about Her Royal Highness's reputation? To Li Yi's surprise, Mississippi Lu wasn't in the courtyard. Wasn't she curious about Mingzhu's decision just now? It wasn't Mississippi Lu's style to not ask if she didn't know, especially when it came to matters related to Emingzu. So he planned to tell her personally. When she asked, he didn't say anything. When she didn't ask, he took the initiative to run over. Li Yi thought for a while and felt that his behavior was a little cheap. So be it. He was used to being cheap anyway. She didn't ask. If he still didn't explain, with her narrow-mindedness, he didn't know what she would think in her heart. Rui and he were telepathic. She had already guessed it. They didn't need to make it clear, and they didn't need to. Mississippi Lu was different. If he let her guess blindly, she could probably make up a wonderful New Year drama. He walked to the door of Mississippi Lu's room, knocked on the door and walked in. Many experiences and lessons showed that it was best not to enter a girl's room without knocking. It was not a good habit to not knock on the door. The frequency of accidentally seeing a girl bathing and changing her clothes was far too high. Even Li Yi suspected that he had some sort of lucky halo on him. It's not good to see indecent things. It's even worse if you don't take responsibility for what you see. Drunk Emo has already taken responsibility, and Ruoqing hasn't. Mississippi Lu, we're a family, so don't be so distant. Mississippi Lu was reading in the room. Li Yi walked over and sat down opposite her. He poured himself a cup of tea and asked tentatively, "Don't you have anything to ask me?" "No," Mississippi Lu replied without raising her head. Li Yi asked again, "Aren't you curious about Mingzhu's decision?" Mississippi Lu replied calmly without raising her head, "I'm not curious." Li Yi stood up, took the book away from her hand, and raised her head to make her look forward. Finally, he sat down opposite her and said, "You're not curious, but I want to say, Mississippi Lu finally stopped being arrogant and looked at him calmly. Li Yi sighed first, and a trace of sadness appeared on his face. He said, "His Majesty, I'm afraid he doesn't have many days left. You know, there's no hope for the king of Shu now. There's an undercurrent in the capital now. All the princes are returning to the capital with the excuse of visiting His Majesty, but they're secretly trying to fight for the throne." Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked, "Does this have anything to do with us?" "Why not?" Li Yi looked at her, knocked on the table and said, "You're the leader of the Lu League. You have so many martial arts masters, officials and nobles under your command. You can tie them up and beat them whenever you want. If you're angry, the entire capital will shake 3 times. Don't doubt that you have such power now." Mississippi Lu continued to listen to him. "Only His Majesty can allow such a force to exist near the capital, because he knows that we won't use this force to do anything to harm the court. But now that the new emperor has changed, will he still trust us like the current His Majesty does? Moreover, you also know that in the current court, our family has already achieved a little bit of success. When the time comes, it will definitely attract the new emperor's suspicion. Maybe it will be used to establish power." Li Yi felt that he needed to explain the stakes in this matter to Mississippi Lu. She had already grown up, and she needed to learn about other things. Mississippi Lu nodded, then looked at him and asked, "What did she feed you just now? I even heard her say that she likes you." "There are some things you can't just listen to," Li Yi said with a headache. "Do you understand what I just said? Do you understand the current situation of our family? Let's go tie up those princes." Mississippi Lu's method was always so simple and direct. Violence is a way to solve problems, but it's not the only way. Li Yi looked at her and said solemnly, "You have to remember, you are a scholar now. A scholar can't always fight and kill." Mississippi Lu nodded and said, "So what did she feed you just now?" "She didn't feed me anything." Li Yi rubbed between his brows, stood up, and pressed down on her shoulder. He said, "We now have 2 paths. The first is to have someone who won't suspect us and won't doubt us become the emperor. And we will continue to stay in the capital. The second is to pack up now. We won't stay in the capital anymore. We'll abandon all the brothels, all the shops, all the properties. We'll take Rui, Xiaohuan, and Emingzu and find a place to occupy the mountain and become king. I choose the second path." Mississippi Lu said without hesitation, looking a little eager to try. Then she seemed to realize something and asked, "Why do we have to take Emingzu with us? Why did they have to take the eldest princess?" Naturally, it was because she was in the same situation as him, or even more dangerous than him. Once the new emperor ascended the throne, could he watch the existence of a princess who was more influential than him in the court, among the people, and in the hearts of all the scholars? If he used his brain a little, he would know what Mingzhu's fate would be after the change of the dynasty. Li Yi sat down, sighed, and said, "If we don't take her with us, you will never see her in the future. When the new emperor ascends the throne, he won't be able to tolerate us, let alone her. At that time he might kill her, and he might let her marry anyone." "Really?" Mississippi Lu raised her head and asked happily. Li Yi really had a headache. Why was it so difficult to communicate with Mississippi Lu? Mississippi Lu suddenly said, "There's something wrong with the way she looks at you." Li Yi frowned and asked, "What's wrong? How can you tell?" "Intuition." Mississippi Lu frowned. Today, the way Emingzu looked at him was not the same as before. There was something else hidden, something that made her vigilant. It was a look that only his sister had when she looked at him. "What's different?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "The way she looks at me is exactly the same as the way you look at me. There's nothing wrong." Mississippi Lu raised her head and looked at him, and her body trembled slightly. Li Yi then looked at her and said slowly, "If Emingzu can become the future emperor, we don't have to worry about anything." A woman becoming the emperor? Mississippi Lu came back to her senses and reached out to touch his forehead. She shook her head and said, "You don't have a fever. You must be crazy. If a woman can be the leader of Wulin, why can't she be the emperor?" Li Yi looked at her and said, "You are also a woman, you can't look down on women." Chapter 937. It seems that you are really crazy. After touching her forehead and checking her pulse, and ruling out the possibility of fever and qigong deviation, Mississippi Lu said with absolute certainty. She no longer cared about Mingzhu's gaze. She crossed her arms in front of her chest, looked at him and asked, "In the martial arts world, martial arts are respected, regardless of gender or age. The emperor is different. Since ancient times, has any woman ever been the emperor?" What she said was wrong. There were too many women who had been the emperor, too many to mention. Let's not talk about the distant ones, let's just talk about. Mississippi Lu's question was off topic. It was not the point they were talking about at all. Li looked at her and asked, "There is a first time for everything. Before you, has there been a woman who has been the chief of Wulin?" Before Mississippi Lu, there had not even been a chief of Wulin, let alone a woman who had been the chief of Wulin. Why couldn't there be a female emperor? Mingzhu is different from other princes and princesses. She has a very high prestige in the court. After the fall of the Cui family, all the civil and military officials in the court are very convinced of her. In the hearts of the people, in the eyes of the scholars, no one can compare to her. If she was a man, I'm afraid she would have been sitting on that throne long ago. This kind of unprecedented thing was suddenly brought up. Of course, it was hard to accept. Fortunately, under his subtle influence over the years, Mississippi Lu's ability to accept new things was very strong. Her eyes showed a look of understanding, which made Li very happy. Mississippi Lu looked up at him and asked, "If Mingzhu becomes the emperor, can't she get married?" Li nodded. He had seen the emperor, but who had the ability to marry the emperor? Mississippi Lu asked again, "Then she can't build a harem?" "What are you thinking about? Mingzhu isn't that kind of person." Li knocked her head with his finger. After he realized it was Mississippi Lu in front of him, not Xiao Huan or Lolita. Half of his buttocks left the chair, ready to escape at any time. Surprisingly, Mississippi Lu didn't seem to care about his unreasonable behavior. She held Autumn water and said, "Okay, since you want to help her, then help her." Although Mississippi Lu was usually a little unruly and headstrong, she was still very reasonable at critical moments. Li was very pleased. Then he thought of something and looked at her and asked, "Just now, you said that the way Mingzhu looked at me was strange. What's wrong?" "Nothing." Mississippi Lu's tone was very unfriendly. She glared at him fiercely, and turned around to return to her room. Being stared at for no reason, Li felt a little wronged. But if she liked to stare at him, then so be it. Anyway, she looked pretty good when she stared at him. Seeing that there was only half a year left until the new year, the next few days would be very busy. The old generals had to go from house to house to get closer to each other. Otherwise, the next time they went to court, there would be no pillar to sleep on. Other important officials in the court also had to find opportunities to contact them. In addition, the royal family had lost face this time. They had to think of a way to regain some of the face they had lost to the king of Shu. Mingzhu was the pride of the royal family, and also the most suitable candidate. The brothel had to come up with some new dramas and stories to praise her achievements. There was no need to exaggerate how good the princess royal was. The people had their own scale, changing the marriage law, opening a medical center, opening a school, managing the court. She was simply a role model for a good princess in the new era, a role model for future generations. There was no other in the world. The warm autumn sun hung high in the sky. The weather was rare. A clean white cloth was spread on the grass. In 2 months, the two little guys would be 1 year old. Now was the time for them to move around more. They crawled around on the white cloth. Xiao Huan and the maid named Yanji from the prince's mansion watched them from the grass. Rui and the prince's concubine were on a boat on the lake. The proud Lolita held her arm to accompany them. It was too far away to hear what they were talking about. Li sat in the pavilion in the middle of the lake and ate a grape. He asked casually, "I heard that a few more princes have returned to the capital?" 3. Li Xian nodded and said, "However, it's useless for them to return to the capital. Even if there's a fight for the crown prince, it won't be their turn." Li Xian shook his head and said, "They might as well learn from the others and stay in their feudal lands obediently." Right now it's easy to enter the capital but hard to leave. Li Xian's words were not without reason. Everyone knew what the princes who had returned to the capital at this time were thinking. However, there was only one position. If they managed to get it, they would transform from a flood dragon to a dragon. If they failed to get it, they could only be a snake, and there was a high chance that they would end up as a dead snake. It was better for those princes who knew that they had no hope of getting the throne and stayed in their feudal lands obediently. It was better to be an idle prince who stood aloof from worldly affairs than to lose their lives. There are 6 adult princes who have stayed in the capital. Prince Qi and Prince Xian are the 2 with the most backing. Of course, they still can't be compared to the king of Shu in the past. However, now that the Cui clan has fallen, there's no hope for the king of Shu. On the surface, it seems that they have the highest chance of getting the throne. Note, the title Prince Qi was something I randomly came up with back then. I didn't take the Qi kingdom into consideration, and there's no other meaning to it. It's useless to dwell on these meaningless things. Let's just treat it as an ordinary title. Li Yi threw the grape skin into the lake, and fish immediately swam over. He then asked, "These princes probably won't be able to stay idle for the time being, right? How can they possibly stay idle?" Li Xian shook his head and said, "They're busy visiting the officials of the imperial court, sending gifts everywhere, forming cliques and seizing power." He suddenly looked at Li Yi and asked, "What should we do now? If you and Emingzu have made any decisions, don't hide it from me again." Li Yi looked at him and said, "Don't you know how to read lips? There's no need for us to tell you to know what we're talking about. Who can hide it from you? You don't have to mock me." Li Xian shook his head and said, "At that time, I wasn't good enough. But it's different now. As long as I'm not too far away and can't see clearly, I can almost guess what you're talking about. Moreover," he changed his tone and said, "even if I don't look, I can guess what Emingzu will choose in the end." Li Xian said with certainty, "For her and for you. She will definitely do it." "You guessed it?" Li looked at him in surprise. It was said that a scholar who had been away for 3 days would be looked at in a new light. Li Xian had suddenly become smart, and it was really hard for him to get used to it. "Of course. I didn't guess it." Li Xian shook his head and said, "A few days ago, Brother Shen said that if the new emperor ascends to the throne, you and Emingzu will be in danger. I thought about it. With Mingzhu's personality, she won't care if she's in danger or not. But with you it's different." Li Yi suddenly looked at him and asked, "You didn't tell this to your brother Shen, did you?" Li Xian shook his head and said, "I'm not stupid. This kind of thing, other than the 3 of us, I can't tell anyone else. Do I look like the kind of person who would casually tell this kind of thing to others?" "That's not necessarily true." Li Yi shook his head and said, "I heard that your brother Shen has a beautiful and charming sister. If you use a honey trap a little, do you think I'll be so ungrateful for a beauty?" Li Xian looked at him and said seriously, "But, you don't say Brother Shen's sister is really beautiful." "I'm just joking. How could I not trust you?" Li Yi waved his hand. In fact, compared to Brother Shen's sister, he was more worried about Brother Shen himself. Speaking of honey traps, Li Xian suddenly looked at him and asked, "You have so many beauties around you, I'm worried about you. Do you think I'm that kind of person?" Li looked at him and asked, "I trusted you so much, and this is how you treat my trust." Hearing this, Li Xian lowered his head in shame and said, "I still think you are. For them, what wouldn't you do? Furthermore, your wife seems to have a younger sister who's even more beautiful and charming than her." Chapter 938. Like a flower, like jade, enchanting, like jade, enchanting. When Mississippi Lu becomes enchanting, Li Yi will also be able to smile in the underworld. Li Xian's face showed a thoughtful expression, and he suddenly asked, "Do you think it's a good idea to let Emingzu sit in that position?" Li Yi peeled an apple, took a bite, put it aside, and picked up another one. "Whether it's for you or for Emingzu, it's the safest for her to sit in that position." Li Xian looked at the pieces of apple skin he peeled and fell down in a spiral shape, and asked, "It's a good thing for any one of you, But what about the two of you? What do you mean? You know what I mean. Li Xian looked at him meaningfully, and when the last piece of apple skin fell down, he stretched out his hand and said, "Thank you." Crack. I don't know. Li Yi took a bite of the apple, and with one in each hand he got up and walked out of the pavilion. Rui and the crown princess had already come down from the boat. The two little fellows seemed to be very interested in the water, so the two had to bring them onto the boat. With Rui around, there was no need to worry about safety. The arrogant Lolita did not get on the boat this time. She trotted over and snatched an apple from Li Yi's hand. She did not care if he took a bite or not, and happily chewed on it. I don't care what you and Imingzi think, and I don't care what's going on between the two of you. Li Xian walked over from behind, holding an unpeeled apple in his hand. After taking a bite, he said, "Let's get through this first. Those fellows in the imperial court have been spoiled. It's time for them to calm down and think about it." After hearing what he said, Li Yi found that he had to face a reality. He had only seen Li Xian a few times recently, but he was no longer the silly and adorable Li Xian from before. Could it be that he had learned this cleverness from Brother Shen? However, this was also a good thing. At the very least, after he became smarter, he could save himself some trouble. The Tsundere Lolita raised her small face and asked, "Brother Xian, what's going on with you and my royal sister?" Li Yi patted her head and said, "He's talking nonsense. Don't listen to him." As she watched Li Yi's figure disappear into the distance, the Tsundere Lolita didn't follow him. She silently nibbled on an apple and muttered, "Sir, you're just brushing me off. Imperial Mother once said that if a man brushed you off and said no, then he really did." These days, the capital was in chaos, unprecedented chaos. A clan with 100 years of history like the Chui clan had suddenly fallen, so how to deal with the Chui clan was a huge problem. How should the officials and nobles that were implicated because of the Chui clan be dealt with? The crimes of the 30 or so families from before had almost been proven, but the implications were too great, so no one dared to make a rash judgment. The king of Shu had fled. Noble consort Chui's position as noble consort had been taken away, and she was still waiting to be dealt with in the cold palace. His Majesty was seriously ill, and the officials had yet to discuss a plan. Some of the envoys from the Qi kingdom had already left the capital. Such a major event had happened in the Jing kingdom. Presumably, the other countries would soon receive the news. When that time came, there would probably be a lot of trouble. The various reforms of the imperial court were still being carried out, and various yamen were constantly dealing with chores. Recently, there had been frequent handover of official positions, and it was difficult for the newly appointed officials to grasp the rules in a short period of time. Prime Minister Qin was sick and had already taken a leave of absence for more than a month. There was no one to preside over the reform, and it couldn't be reversed or stopped. Under such circumstances, the princes had entered the capital without being summoned. Although it was against the law, they were ostensibly visiting the emperor, and no one could use this reason to expel them. It would be fine if they behaved themselves in the capital, but these princes were each more anxious than the other. They kept on visiting the important officials in the imperial court, and it was obvious how desperate they were. Of course, the most important thing was that the eldest princess was also sick and hadn't attended court for 3 days. When Her Highness was around, although these things still existed, Her Highness would always be able to make proper arrangements for everything. Now that Her Highness was sick, the morning court session wasn't held, and the officials were without a leader. Chaos everywhere. During these few days, all the officials from the 3 provinces, 6 ministries, and 24 departments were looking forward to it. When Her Highness was around, they didn't feel anything. Now that Her Highness had taken a leave of absence, the entire imperial court seemed to be in a mess. In the Shangshu province, this new policy was proposed by Her Highness. Now that the implementation has met with obstacles, it needs to be resolved immediately. What should we do? Lord Dong, you've been with the princess for a long time. Please say something. Dong Wenyan shook his head and said, "My understanding of this is limited, and I don't dare to speak recklessly." Suddenly, someone slapped the table fiercely and said, "What is Prince Xian trying to do? The invitation has already been sent to the Shangshu province. Is he that impatient?" These are all small matters. How should we deal with the Chui clan's matter? His Majesty and the princess haven't given us any information, so we can't make a rash decision. Prime Minister Qin. Prime Minister Qin hasn't been here for a long time. This can't go on. I wonder how Her Highness's condition is. When will she get better? It's not good for us to inquire about such matters. The complicated imperial court affairs caused countless officials to feel troubled, and the entire Shangshu province was in a state of chaos. This is the Shangshu province. What's with all the commotion? An elderly voice rang out from outside the door, and everyone's gazes quickly looked over. Prime Minister Qin. Prime Minister Qin, you're finally back. Quick, quick, come in. Someone walked out quickly and helped Prime Minister Qin, who was holding onto a walking stick, into a chair. Prime Minister Qin tapped his walking stick heavily on the ground, and said with a disappointed expression, "All of you are the pillars of our Jing kingdom, the pillars of the imperial court. The entire country's future depends on all of you. The eldest princess has only been away for a few days. Look at all of you. Look at all of you. Do all of you still look like officials of the imperial court?" Hearing this, everyone lowered their heads in shame. Prime Minister Qin was right. They had already forgotten what it was like in the past. However, ever since the eldest princess took over the government, whenever they encountered any problems that they could not solve, they would just need to submit a report, and there would be a perfect solution very soon. They were already used to such a life, going to the yamen every day. There were no headaches, and when they were in a good mood, they would go home and change into casual clothes. They could even go to the brothels to listen to plays. It was naturally impossible for them to get used to returning to the days where they had a headache every day. Prime Minister Qin coughed a few times before standing up. He looked at everyone and asked, "Look at all of you now. If Her Highness no longer takes over the government in the future, are you all going to continue being like this?" Everyone looked even more ashamed. Prime Minister Qin was right. Her Highness was only acting for a while. When the new emperor succeeded the throne, she would naturally leave the imperial court. This was a fact that they had always ignored. After Prime Minister Qin's reminder, they finally realized something. Her Highness would eventually leave. After Her Highness left, who would inherit the position? One of those mediocre people who visited the ministers one by one in the capital? Without Her Highness, what kind of life would they have in the future? It was enough to think about the past few days. Of course, this was only an ideal situation. If there were no accidents, it would be much more difficult than it was now. It was easy to go from frugality to extravagance, but difficult to go from extravagance to frugality. They had already gotten used to the previous way. They could no longer easily turn back. Why did they have to turn back? This was a question worthy of everyone's consideration. Li Yi and Li Xian didn't need to think about it. After September, the weather would gradually become cold. It was better to sit down and eat a hot pot than to think about those messy things. Mississippi Lu and Princess Royal wanted to see who could cut the lamb thinner and taste better. Naturally, there needed to be a judge. Li Yi shook his head and said, "It's been too hot these days. I can't taste it in my mouth." If you can't taste it, just say that you can't taste it. Don't make excuses. Li Xian glanced at him and volunteered. He waved his hand. "I'm good at tasting dishes. I'll do it." Li Yi looked at him and decided to take back his evaluation of him a few days ago. Li Xian put the meat rolls they had cut into the pot. After tasting it, he already had an answer in his heart. He nodded and said, "I think." Mississippi Lu unsheathed autumn water and began to carefully wipe it. Princess Royal looked into the distance and cracked her knuckles. "I think." Li Xian blinked his eyes and began to sweat. He looked at Li Yi, who was quietly eating next to him. When he turned back, he shook his head with a serious face and said, "I'm sorry, I've also been too hot these days. I really can't taste it." Chapter 939. In the end, in order to prove that Emingzu and Rui's culinary skills were on par, Li Xian finished all the remaining meat rolls by himself. Perhaps it was because he had eaten too much, but his face was red. He looked at Li Yi with a resentful gaze. Young people had to grow up. In the past, he had been as innocent as Li Xian. Later on, he was taught by Mississippi Lu and the Princess Royal. He understood that at some junctures in life, it was better to give up than to make a choice. Li Xian rubbed his stomach and laid on the chair without any grace. He mumbled, "I was right? The officials in the court have long been spoiled by Emingzu. Without Emingzu, they wouldn't dare to do anything. Look at how chaotic the court is now." It had to be said that Li Xian's idea was not bad. Even Li Yi didn't think of it. There was a saying that went like this. There was once a wise empress who stood in front of the officials, but they didn't cherish her. When they lost her, it was too late for regrets. This was the most painful thing in the world. Although Her Highness's few days off were not enough for the courtiers to think about a certain aspect, it was enough for them to calm down and consider many things. This is a good idea. Li Yi nodded and gave him a thumbs up. He passed an apple to him and said, "Eat some fruits after a meal. It's good for your health." Li Xian's eyes widened. He covered his mouth and ran out. The word eat was not something he could even hear. Because he was too young, he ate too much until he vomited. This was his punishment for making promises so easily. After vomiting, Li Xian's complexion looked much better. However, he slumped into his chair, his bearing as a member of the royal family completely gone. The Princess Royal didn't stay in the palace for a few days. Naturally, the officials couldn't get any information. The strange thing was that she and Mississippi Lu were enemies, but they were always together. Except for sleeping, they spent most of their time together. Li Yi couldn't figure it out. Besides martial arts, what else did they have in common? They couldn't be exchanging experiences other than fighting, right? This made Li Yi a little worried. He looked back at Li Xian and asked, "Help me see what they are talking about." He was now very convinced by Li Xian's lip reading. And he finally discovered his greatest strength. Never underestimate a man with a gossipy heart. Because you never know how much effort he would put into peep. I can see clearly only when I concentrate. Don't disturb me. Li Xian took out a small telescope from his sleeve and put it to his eyes. Emingzu said that your Rui is too violent. It's not good to always use force on you. And the places he hits are not elegant. Li Yi was deeply gratified. Her Royal Highness was a princess after all. She would love others. This was something that Mississippi Lu, who only advocated violence, would not understand. She also said that she found a secret skill in the palace's library a few days ago. It can make people feel unbearable pain when performing the skill. After the skill is performed, it will return to normal without leaving any trace. She suggested that Rui learn it. Li Yi suddenly remembered that he also had something to suggest to Rui. Right now, Emingzu was still the eldest princess. The two of them could often compare notes with each other. In the future, there would not be many opportunities like this. Rui wanted to seize the opportunity to humiliate her a few more times. After all, a tiger's butt could not be touched, and an empress's butt could not be spanked. If he did not take advantage of this opportunity, there would not be another one in the future. If she needed help, he could provide it for free. Ministry of Revenue. Minister of Revenue Qin Huan personally saw a person out of the yamen with a smile on his face. He said, "These days the Ministry of Revenue has been busy with the tax reform. If not for you, I would have a headache." Sung Shichen shook his head and said, "Lord Qin, you are exaggerating. As the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Revenue, this is my duty." Although there was a difference in rank between the two, Sung Shichen was not only the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Revenue, but also the Governor of the capital. He held two important positions. Qin Huan was very polite to him and said with a smile, "These days, Lord Sung, you must be very tired from running between the yamen and the Ministry of Revenue. Quickly go back and rest. Leave the rest of the Ministry of Revenue to someone else. Her Highness's condition has improved. I still have to go to the palace to report. Lord Qin, please see me off." Sung Shichen cupped his hands and turned to get into the carriage. Morning dew hall in the palace. After Sung Shichen finished reporting, he said, "Your Highness, there are already 7 princes who have returned to the capital without His Majesty's edict. The court has different opinions on this. May I ask how this matter should be handled?" Father has no objections on this matter. There is no need to discuss it further. Emingzu put down a memorial and looked down. She said, recently all the yamens have been busy. It must be tiring for you to be busy with both the capital yamen and the Ministry of Revenue. Sung Shichen bowed and said, this is this official's duty. Emingzu nodded and said, although I am working for the court, it is not easy to arrange the affairs of the two manors so well. Reward me with 1,000 bolts of silk and allow me 5 days of rest. This official is the capital governor and the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue. This official should do his best for the court. This is my duty. Sung Shichen knelt on the ground and said, Your Highness has shown me gratitude. This official will also be forever loyal to Your Highness. Emingzu put down the memorial in her hand and looked at Sung Shichen. Pledging loyalty to the imperial court and pledging loyalty to her were two different concepts. Sung Shichen had been an official for many years and held a high position. He could not understand the difference between these two sentences. After a while, she sat down again and nodded. Rise. The capital governor was an official in charge of the capital and the Hebei region. He was only a fourth-rank official. In the court, there were many officials who were higher than him. However, in terms of status, the capital governor was no less than the 6 ministers and the chief officials of the 3 provinces. The former capital governor, Dong Wenyun, had already become the mainstay of the Shangshu province. The 2 prime ministers had also held this position before. Generally speaking, this position was just a transitional one. Once they got through it, they would immediately become a true high-ranking official of the court. The current capital governor, Sung Shichen, was originally an official in the King of Shu's faction. Later, he caught the eye of Her Highness and was promoted to his current position. He played an important role in a major case at the beginning of the year and received unanimous praise from the people of the capital. A few days ago, the officials in the King of Shu's faction were implicated. There were not many families like the Tsung family that survived. The capital governor's residence. A middle-aged official stroked the beard on his chin and shook his head. Everyone in the imperial court is extremely busy now. I'm only able to have this little bit of leisure time because I'm busy. Only Lord Zeng, who is in a high position, still has such leisure and elegance. I'm really envious of you. Sung Shichen smiled and took a sip of tea. He unhurriedly put down a chess piece and said, What Lord Su said is not reasonable. 2 days ago, I was just as busy as my colleagues in the court. If it weren't for Her Royal Highness, who allowed me 5 days of rest, how would I have the time to drink tea and play chess now? The official surnamed Su smiled. Her Highness values Lord Tseng very much. Perhaps in the future, she will have to rely on Lord Tseng. Just as he finished speaking, a servant of the Tseng family knocked on the door and entered, handing an invitation to Sung Shichen. Sung Shichen glanced at it and threw it to the side. He sighed and shook his head slightly. The official surnamed Su was surprised. Lord Tseng, why are you sighing? Prince Xian sent an invitation, inviting me to a banquet tonight. So that's how it is. Lord Su put down his chess piece, shook his head and said, I have received several similar invitations in recent days. These princes are still too anxious. The topic had already changed. Sung Shichen casually asked, In Lord Su's opinion, which of His Majesty's princes is the most virtuous and has the most hope of inheriting the throne? His Majesty is so wise, but none of the princes have learned a single bit of His Majesty's ability. The official surnamed Su shook his head and said, The Prince of Shu, Prince of Xian, Prince of Qi. These princes are all mediocre. In terms of virtue, just look at the news from their fiefs. Not to mention a hair on the eldest princess's head. Even the heir of the Prince of Ning is better than all of them combined. In fact, they can't even compare to a child of Prince Jean. The eldest princess has the talent to rule the world, but unfortunately, she is a woman. Sung Shichen sighed and said, If Prince Xian or Prince Qi were to inherit the throne, I really can't imagine what the world would become in the end. Seemingly affected by his words, the official surnamed Su also revealed a vexed expression. To tell you the truth, Lord Sung, the eldest princess is unwell this time. I and several colleagues have also thought about this problem. Her Highness and many officials have put in a lot of effort to achieve this. Is it going to be ruined in the hands of others in the future? Sung Shichen revealed a helpless expression. But the eldest princess is only acting in power, and will soon leave the court. It's impossible for her to always. Who said it's impossible? The official surnamed Su raised his head and looked at him. The princes are mediocre, but there is still Prince Jean. In terms of identity, status, and ability, who among the princes can compare to Prince Jean? It's just that Prince Jean is young, and can't take on great responsibilities. But before Prince Jean comes of age, the eldest princess can act in power. Isn't that the best of both worlds? Sung Shichen looked at him and said in a low voice, Lord Su, be careful with your words. Chapter 940. Sung Shichen looked at him and said with a frown, Lord Su, you know, other than His Majesty, it's not appropriate for us to talk about this. The appointment of the crown prince had always been the emperor's family affairs. As foreign officials, they shouldn't say much. However, at this moment, Lord Su was obviously exposed. He waved his hand and said, Lord Sung, I'm not afraid to let you know that this is not only my intention, but also the intention of many of my colleagues. If the throne is really inherited by one of Prince Xian or Prince Qi, then all the hard work we've put in over the years, everything Her Highness has done for the Jing Kingdom, and all the achievements we've made so far, will be for naught. Sung Shichen looked up at him and asked, Are there other officials in the imperial court who think so too? Although Prince Jean is young, he's extremely intelligent. Now in the school of mathematics, he's almost independent. He's only 12 years old and is still immature, but in a few years he'll be able to support the country. Lord Su didn't directly answer Sung Shichen's question and continued. Before that, it's most suitable for the eldest princess to continue to govern. Her Highness is deeply trusted by the officials, and has won the hearts of the people. She's loved by all the officials in the world. If it's just the regent, I believe no one will object. Sung Shichen revealed a thoughtful expression. What Lord Su said makes some sense. Let me think about it. Lord Sung, please consider this matter as soon as possible. I also need to contact a few colleagues and discuss it with other colleagues in the imperial court. Before the game was over, Lord Su took a sip of tea, stood up, and cupped his hands, saying, I'll take my leave today. Sung Shichen stood up to send him off. Take care, Lord Su. Lord Su was deep in thought. When he walked out of the capital governor's residence, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. There seemed to be something wrong. He came here today only to drink a cup of tea and play chess. Why would he discuss the appointment of the crown prince? Why would he reveal this immature idea in his heart? He thought about it carefully and finally understood. He had wanted to drink tea and play chess. He could only blame Prince Xian's post. If it wasn't because of that sudden post, he would still be locked in a battle with Lord Zeng on the chessboard. However, since this topic had been brought up, he couldn't avoid it anymore. Although today was an accident, this matter was indeed imminent. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but quicken his pace. Li Han was indeed a good kid. Especially in the past 2 years. He had grown extremely quickly. In just 2 to 3 years, he had grown from a naughty kid who used to pee in his pants to a man who was feared by the students of the Mathematics Academy. The reason why they were terrified was because he was not only Prince Jean, but also the vice dean and the director of political education. In the absence of the dean, he was the dean of the college. He was in charge of all affairs including student rewards and punishments. In terms of status and identity, no one in the academy could compare to him. In terms of knowledge, he was the most outstanding. In addition, he liked to use the method of frog jumping to punish students. It had become a shadow in the hearts of the students of the mathematics faculty that could not be erased. Of course, in front of outsiders, no matter how tough he appeared, he could not hide the fact that he was only 12 years old. That Tsundere Lolita, who was almost 15 years old, was his nemesis. Li Han was instructed to put on the chicken wings while she ran excitedly to Li Xian's side, wanting him to show her the technique of knowing what people were talking about without listening to them. Brother Xian, help me take a look. What is Li Han muttering softly over there? Li Xian turned his head to take a look. After a moment he turned back and said, he said that royal sister Shanning is the laziest and only knows how to eat. She let him do all the dirty and tiring work. Such a lazy girl, no one will want her in the future. The Tsundere Lolita ran over angrily and twisted Li Han's ear. The latter had a horrified expression and said with a trembling voice, Royal sister, how did you know? Great, you actually dared to secretly scold me. The Tsundere Lolita actually said that no one would want her in the future. The Tsundere Lolita turned her head to look in a certain direction. When she saw Li Yi sitting together with the eldest princess, she exerted even more force. Li Yi looked at Li Han, who was being chased by Shanning, and turned his head to ask Emingzu, what do you think of Prince Jean? Li Han is a good child. Emingzu nodded and said, although he is young, he is the one who can endure hardships the most out of all the princes. These few years he has been put in the arithmetic academy to train, and he has grown a lot. He has already left the other princes of his age far behind. Li Yi nodded and said, in the past he was a little mischievous. These 2 years he has finally calmed down. I don't know what will happen in the future, but at least for now, his nature is still very pure. The king of Shu had lost power, and the old emperor was seriously ill. Many princes couldn't wait to enter the capital, and they couldn't wait to start the fight for the throne. Their efforts didn't go to waste. After the prince's invitations and visits, the officials and nobles in the capital finally had some changes in the direction of the court. These days, the voices calling for Prince Jean, Li Han, to succeed the throne were very loud. After all, apart from his young age, Prince Jean was much better than those princes in some aspects. When he was 10 years old, he had single-handedly crushed the conspiracy of the Qi Kingdom's diplomatic mission, and saved the face of the Jing Kingdom. These few years he had devoted himself to the study of mathematics, and it was unknown how many difficult problems he had solved for the court, and who knew how many mathematical talents he had trained for the court. Wouldn't it be better for such a person to be the emperor than those idiotic princes? Being young was not a problem. Behind him, there was the eldest princess regent. As the emperor, he just needed to grow up. In the process of growing up, if he could learn 10 or 20% of the eldest princess's knowledge, it would be enough to deal with the complicated political affairs. After all, what the officials cared about was not who would become the emperor, but whether or not the court would be as stable as it was now after that person became the emperor. Would they still be able to follow the eldest princess to get rid of the internal troubles, deter the external enemies, and implement one beneficial policy after another to make the weak Jing Kingdom stronger and stronger? Emingzu looked into the distance and said, I hope that in the future he can be like father. Why do you care so far away? Li Yi glanced at her and said, anyway, in a few years. Emingzu tilted her head to look at him and asked, what about in a few years? Li Yi looked away and shook his head. Let's talk about it in a few years. In a pavilion far away from them, Changde helped Emperor Jing to sit down slowly and stood quietly at the side. Prince Ning slowly walked over and helped him tidy up the fur coat on his shoulders, and sat beside him. Emperor Jing tilted his head and looked into the distance. These days, there seems to be some other voices in the court? Prince Ning nodded and said, a few days ago, there were suddenly more voices in the court calling for Prince Jean to succeed the throne, and for Emingzu to become the regent. Emperor Jing looked forward and murmured, I did not expect that there would be a day when this country could not do without Emingzu. She has suffered. Prince Ning looked up into the distance and shook his head. Although she is a woman, as a member of the royal family, this is what she should do. After he finished speaking, he looked at Emperor Jing and asked, Imperial brother still hasn't announced it. Are you waiting for next year's court meeting? What do you think His Majesty and Prince Ning are talking about? Li Yi looked at the pavilion in the distance, then looked at Li Xian and asked, why don't you take a look? Maybe Imperial uncle and Imperial father are talking about something important. This is not good, right? Li Xian shook his head and took out the binoculars from his arms. What court meeting? Li Xian frowned and waved his hand. Don't talk and don't move. Otherwise, I won't be able to see it. When Li Xian was concentrating, He needed to isolate himself from the outside world. Li Yi simply held his breath. Mingzhu's lips moved as if she wanted to say something, but in the end, she shook her head and let them be. This is Xian Er's responsibility. Li Xian looked in that direction attentively and murmured. What my responsibility? What responsibility do I have? If Mingzhu is a man. Li Xian couldn't help laughing. He reached out and patted Li Yi. If Mingzhu is a man, you will die of anger. In order to protect him, you kept him by your side with Mingzhu. Li Xian's body suddenly froze and he could no longer speak. After a long time his face showed anger. He suddenly raised his hand and the binoculars fell to the ground and scattered. His face was ferocious, but his body could not stop trembling. He pointed in a certain direction and scolded. What kind of lousy lip reading is this? How dare he use this kind of thing to deceive me? I will kill him when I return. Chapter 941. In order to create a quiet environment for Li Xian, Li Yi and the eldest princess did not make any noise. Li Xian suddenly flew into a rage. After he smashed the telescope in his hand, the atmosphere became even quieter. Li Yi looked away from him and met the eldest princess's eyes. There seemed to be 1,000 words in his heart, but when the words reached his mouth, he could only open his mouth. Mingzhu was the same as him. Because of some news, her state of mind was disturbed, and her eyes lost focus. Some things existed in the heart. Originally, they were just doubts, like a veil in the fog, hazy and unclear, until the wind blew and blew everything away, revealing the naked truth. The doubts in the heart could all be connected. One was the ruler of a country, and the other was the mistress of the harem. Why did they hide it from the officials and secretly leave the capital to come to Qing, and prefecture hundreds of miles away? They almost lost their lives there. The old emperor was also very good to Li Xian. He was so good that it was beyond the limit. Almost all of his requests were granted. He was so good that he treated him better than his own son. The empress treasured the crown princess even more. She often brought her to the palace. She was no less than her own daughter, Mingzhu. On the contrary, Princess Ning frequently entered the palace as soon as she arrived in the capital. Almost everything she did, she would ask for Mingzhu's company. The Wang family abandoned the most powerful king of Shu and married their daughter to Li Xian. They were not at all worried about the revenge of the king of Shu after he ascended to the throne. This was not stupid. They were choosing sides. Li Yi finally understood where the master of the Wang family's eternal confidence came from. As wise and far-sighted as the old emperor, how could he not know the importance of choosing a successor to the country? But no matter how dangerous the situation was, he avoided this issue, because there was nothing to talk about. He already had a candidate in mind, but before that, he had to help him clear up the internal and external troubles of the Jing kingdom. Until now, the Cui family had fallen, the king of Shu had escaped, the capital had been bathed in blood, and the enemies did not dare to act rashly under the threat of Tianfa. Most importantly, Mingzhu and Li Xian's birthdays were on the same day. Princess Ning and the empress happened to be in the same summer palace when they gave birth. After that, they lived in the same place for many days. Li Yi didn't know if their birthdays were on the same day, but he knew that he was extremely stupid. There were so many coincidences, so many obvious clues, but he had never thought in that direction. When he found out the truth, he couldn't even say a word. The old emperor and the empress were worried that Li Xian would be like the previous two princes who had died young and would be persecuted by evil people, so they swapped him with Prince Ning's daughter. Li Xian went to Qing, and Fu, and Mingzhu stayed in the capital. Who would care about a princess and think that she could threaten their throne? Of course, reality proved that they were wrong. Even if the empress gave birth to a princess, she could still threaten the throne they wanted. And the reason for all of this was because of everything Li Xian, and Mingzhu had done these few years. Of course, Li Xian's good idea had changed the situation in the court, allowing the thing that had been hidden under the water to surface. And this was also the most laughable, or rather ironic. He personally handed over the throne that belonged to him to Mingzhu. His eagerness were even more than Mingzhu himself. Li Xian stepped on the telescope that had already been broken into pieces. Then he turned his head and looked at Li Yi and Emingzu with a pale face. He murmured, "Save me." The eldest princess raised her head to look at him. A smile suddenly appeared on her face. Like a taut string suddenly relaxing. Her entire person relaxed in this instant. She said, "Actually, this is the best ending." Li patted his shoulder and sighed. "Good luck, we all think highly of you." "No, you can't do this to me." We agreed. Li Xian's body trembled. His expression was terrified, and his voice was slightly hysterical. "I'll go back first," Emingzu said softly. She turned around and walked in the direction she came from. Li didn't know what to say to her. At this time, it was not only that matter that was involved, but also her life experience. In an instant, her father was not her father, and her mother was not her mother. For the past 20 years, she had been kept in the dark. No matter how strong she was, she needed time to accept it. "I'll go back too." Li Yi shook his head. With such a huge gap, not only Emingzi needed time, but at this time all three of them needed time. Li Xian shook his head violently and murmured, "You can't do this, you can't do this." Li Yi really couldn't think of any words to comfort him. After looking at him apologetically, he turned around and left. The proud Lolita ran over from a distance. She raised a roasted black chicken wing to Li Yi and said, "Sir, the chicken wing is ready. I roasted it for you myself. Try it." Li Yi took the chicken wing and took a bite. He knew that she not only forgot to add seasoning, but also did not roast it well enough. The outside was already black, and the inside was still a little raw. The proud Lolita asked expectantly, "How does it taste?" Li finished the chicken wing in 2 or 3 bites, wiped his fingers and nodded. "It's delicious." "Then I'll roast it for you, sir." The nervous expression on the proud Lolita's face disappeared. Finally, joy appeared on her face, and she ran quickly to the grill. Li stopped her, shook his head, and said, "Sir has something to do. I'll go back first." "Oh." The proud Lolita responded with some disappointment. Then she raised her head, smiled, and said, "It's okay. Sir's business is more important. If you like it, I'll roast it for you next time." Li smiled at her, turned around and left. After a while, the proud Lolita put her hands on her hips and looked down at Li Han, who was squatting on the ground. She asked, "How is it? Is it delicious?" Li Han said with a bitter face, "I'm not eating it. The outside is burnt, and the inside is not cooked. I forgot to add seasoning. It's not delicious. I'll have diarrhea if I eat it." "Nonsense." The proud Lolita looked at him with shame and anger, and said, "I roasted it like this just now. Sir said it was delicious, and he ate it all." Li Han's face became even more bitter. He looked at her and said, "That's because Sir likes you. No matter how bad your roasted food is, even if you gave Sir a raw one, he would still say it was delicious." The anger on the proud Lolita's face immediately turned into shyness. She pinched the corner of her clothes and said to herself, "Really? Mother seemed to say the same thing. Really?" Li Han raised his hand and said, "I swear among everyone apart from Yongning, you're the one that Sir likes the most." When he saw his royal sister frown, he immediately changed his words and said, "No, Sir likes you and Yongning the most. He likes both of you the most." After a long while, Li Han sat on the ground and let out a long sigh of relief as he watched his royal sister, Shanning, run away shyly. The chicken wing she roasted was really terrible. This was the worst chicken wing he had ever eaten. How could Sir lie like this? He even ate it all. Wasn't he afraid of diarrhea? Of course, he could only say these words in his heart this time. He didn't dare to whisper them out loud. "Little Han." A voice suddenly came from behind him. Li Han jumped up from the ground in fright. He only relaxed when he saw who it was. He asked, "Brother Xian, why are you looking for me?" An extremely kind smile appeared on Li Xian's face as he said, "Come here. Brother Xian has something to tell you." Although Brother Xian's smile was very kind, as if he had some great news to tell him, Li Han felt a chill run down his spine. He felt his hair stand on end, as if a great disaster was about to befall him. Sir had said that when you faced an unknown problem that you couldn't handle, You should rely on your intuition. Li Han's first instinct was to run. Thus he really ran. He was extremely fast and didn't even look back. It was as if there was a monster chasing after him. Li Xian smiled as he looked at the rapidly fleeing figure. He extended his hand and murmured, "No matter how fast the little monkey runs, he won't be able to escape from the palm of the Buddha." You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.